Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku was dismissed as a useless blind child? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. The world had collapsed around Midoriya Izuku twice in his 15 short years on the globe. The first time it happened, he was 4 years old, and he was sitting on a small spinning chair in a black room. The room was black because the world was black, and the world was black because the world was always black for Izuku. He had been totally blind since Biartich, but that wasn't what brought his world crashing down. His world had always been black, and that was okay, because he didn't need sight to become a hero, like he had always wanted. No, the 8 words that destroyed Izuku's world were, "I'm afraid your son is quirkless, Mrs. Midoriya." Such simple words, really. Just a few vibrations in the air rippled through his vision of his future, of the first blind hero, of Kaken finally acknowledging that he wasn't useless, of saving others. All fragmented and shattered and left to rot in the wake of those 8 words. So Izuku sat in his mother's arms and let drops of salty water fall onto the floor. Quirkless. Useless. Helpless. I can still become a hero, right? Soft arms embraced him, pulled him into a warm embrace. "I'm so sorry, Izuku. So sorry." His mother sobbed into his chest and let her tears join his on the hardwood floor. Those weren't the words Izuku wanted to hear, though. He wanted his mother to say he could become a hero anyway. Hope always wins, right? The second time Izuku's world collapsed around him was 3 years later at the age of 7. The past 3 years hadn't been great, and he didn't have any friends, but it was fine. He had his mum, and he had a dream. How fast one would leave him that bright afternoon. But that hadn't happened yet, and right now, he was surrounded by sound. Wave upon wave of words assaulted his ears from everywhere all at once. It made him want to curl into a ball and hide until all the noise went away. He'd never been somewhere so loud, so vibrant. As soon as he thought that, he paused. Yes, that was the word. Vibrant. This place was full of life. He and Inko were in the middle of the mall, the latter clutching tightly at Izuku's hand, who wasn't sure if he was grateful for or resented the move. Sure, the mall was big, but just because he was blind didn't mean he couldn't take care of himself as well as anyone else. His mum started pulling him towards a store on the left side of the mall. "Come on, Izuku, there's a lovely All Might backpack over here." As soon as he heard that, he rushed ahead of his mum to pull her along instead. Inko let a small smile play around her lips. However he might protest otherwise, her son was still a hero nerd at heart. She hoped, prayed, that he would never change, that he would stay as her little ray of sunshine. How sad that she wouldn't be around to see that wish granted. Yamada Hisashi was not having a good day. He'd slept through his alarm this morning, and now was standing outside a mall in the Shizuoka prefecture filled with the screams and running footsteps of panicked civilians. He had no idea why Nedzu agreed to send him of all people to deal with this, not when his class were meant to have assessments today, though he supposed that his quirk was ideal for this situation. Oh, scratch that. He was just annoyed that the villains decided to break their 2-week silence today, the one day where he just wanted to go home and sleep. Well, he thought, I suppose this could be slightly therapeutic too. So Hisashi opened his mouth, felt the tingle of his quirk settle into his vocal cords, and let his voice fill the space around him. "All civilians, please evacuate the building. This is not a drill. There has been a villain attack. I repeat, all civilians evacuate the building." Izuku's head snapped up towards the source of the sound. He would recognize that voice anywhere. It was Present Mike. Sure, his speech might be missing the usual "yeah" that he normally slotted into every sentence, but Izuku would never forget the voice of his favorite radio host. After all, he listened to him every day. Although he supposed that the announcement was a bit late for him and his mum, because they were already in the middle of said villain attack. The lady, or at least Izuku assumed it was a lady from the sound of her voice, who was holding them hostage, snarled and pushed him back down. "Stay, you insolent idiot. Honestly, we wanted hostages, not useless blind children." Izuku's head hit the cool tile floor of the shop, and he could dimly hear his mother yelling at the lady from his left. He could barely sense anything over the rush and roar of blood in his ears. He didn't think he'd ever felt so angry. All the time others had pushed him down, again and again and again. When he was told he was useless, helpless, quirkless. Again and again and again, and he was sick of it and wished they would all shut up, and the pale lights began to fill his vision. No, not lights. Outlines. It was so disorienting, all these edges and tops and textures. He wondered how people coped with it every day. But now wasn't the time to think about that, because he could very clearly see the outline of the villain women in front of him, she who for Izuku, in that slow, drawn-out stretch of time, represented everyone who had ever beat him and pulled him down. He got to his feet. When the quirkless boy gained what he wanted, only to lose what he needed, only 3 people existed in his world. The boy, filled with dreams and hope of one day becoming a hero, of proving everyone who had ever doubted him wrong. The girl, barely past 20, twisted and dead inside, yet still so undeserving of her fate. The woman, trying to protect her son, head turned to the side, cheek red from the force of the slap she had just received. The boy's eyes were green, his vision was red, his hands sought vengeance, and the girl was so close. The girl's form glowed green, the little corner of her cloak the boy was clutching glowed greener, and both cloak and girl flew across the room, landing with a sickening crack against a wall. The quirkless boy wasn't quirkless, and neither was he blind. The woman stared at her son, pride and horror evident in her voice as she hugged him. The boy realized that for the first time ever, he could see his mother's face. See the shine in her eyes and the smile on her face for the very first time. He hugged her back, harder than he ever had in his life. The world exploded. Hizashi stared at the ruins of the shop in shock, unable to process the fact that he was too late. Black smoke billowed out of the store, rising up into the overcast sky like some huge, ugly fat slug. He was already regretting his thoughts from before. It felt like some huge act of cosmic karma to punish him for complaining, somehow. Never mind that it was completely irrational, he couldn't shake the feeling that somehow this was all his fault. The death of all the people inside that building was his fault. Because surely no one had survived that explosion. He was standing 3 meters away, and he could feel the heat on his face. He was shaken from his reverie by the sound of a child's cry from the wreckage. And when the rescue team pulled out a small boy with curly green hair and eyes that seemed to alternate between toxic and pastel green, he knew nothing would ever be the same again. Hizashi. Today 7 o'clock. Hey Shoyuta, can you come down to Mizudafu General Hospital like now? Something happened while I was out on patrol. Aizawa Shoyuta closed his phone and sighed. He was meant to be out on patrol in an hour, but Hizashi knew that, so if he texted it must be something big. He sighed again, readied his capture weapon and started swinging over rooftops towards the hospital. If he was traveling a little faster than normal, that was definitely not because he was worried about his idiotic husband. Nope, definitely not. When Shota finally arrived at the hospital 30 minutes later, he had already braced himself to see his husband brutally injured, or at the very least sick in a hospital bed. What he was not expecting was for the blonde idiot to be sitting in a plastic hospital chair, still in his hero costume, not a scratch on him. He sighed. So what was so important that you, Shoyuta, cut himself off, because something was wrong? Hizashi hadn't uttered a word since he had arrived. He'd barely even glanced up. That was not normal. Shoyuta could ordinarily never get the blonde idiot to shut up, and though he complained about it constantly, the absence of his partner's usually vibrant energy was disconcerting, to say the least. Shoyuta knelt down so his eyes were level with Hizashi's. Zashi? Are you okay? Shoyuta visibly tensed with how weak and broken his voice sounded, because he had never seen Hizashi this upset, ever. They all died, Sho. There were villains and they took hostages, and Sho, they're all dead. All of them, and I couldn't do anything. At this point Hizashi just broke down crying, and Shoyuta ended up having to get the story from one of the sidekicks who had been there during the attack. Apparently, a shop full of hostages had exploded during a villain attack, killing everyone inside other than one small boy who was currently in intensive care in the hospital. Hisashi had taken it really hard and insisted on following the boy to the hospital, and he hadn't moved since. Shoyuta's side sat next to the prone form of his husband. Losing people was never easy, and Zashi had a larger heart than most. He leaned his head against the wall and resigned himself to a long night. If seeing the boy well again would help Hisashi, then he'd sit there for as long as necessary. "Excuse me? Are you the pro-heroes who brought in the boy from the villain attack?" Shoyuta jolted out of sleep rapidly. He almost flung his capture scarves at the woman, until he released what he was doing and settled down his chair again, clearing his throat and checking his watch. It was almost 2 in the morning, meaning he had slept for over 7 hours. No wonder he suddenly felt really alert. "Yes, that would be us," Shoyuta answered gruffly, his throat raspy and dry from sleep. He decided not to mention the fact that he hadn't actually been involved in the attack. If he did, they might not let him see the kid, and there was no way that Hisashi was in the right state of mind right now to go himself. "Great," the nurse responded. "The kid has just woken up, and since he has no living relatives, we'd like to discuss some interesting developments with you." She walked towards the elevator and Shoyuta followed after tugging Hisashi to his feet. Upon closer inspection, it was clear the woman had a mutant-type quirk. Long, curling horns rose from her forehead and a thin tail fell from her uniform. "So," the woman said as she stepped into the elevator, "the child you rescued, Midoriya Izuku, is a bit of a mystery to us. His mum is his only listed relative, and she, well." The nurse cleared her throat. "Oh, I just realized that I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Nurse Izawa. And this here is Yamada," Shoyuta said, nudging his husband. Hisashi hadn't said a single word past the broken explanation when he arrived. Okay, that was not good. He was going to have to fix that when they got home, but for now, the kid. Right, the nurse said, gazing at a spot above their heads. "Well, as I was saying, since Midoriya has no living relatives, we were going to leave him to the foster system, but..." She trailed off and makes no attempt to reinitiate the conversation. "But what?" Shoyuta prompted. "I'll let you see for yourselves." "We're here." The room was white. The curtains were white, the bed was white, and the bandages wrapped around Midoriya Izuku's small, prone form were white too. Apart from where the red seeped through. Shoyuta stepped gingerly through the doorframe and set himself down in one of the flimsy plastic chairs. Hisashi followed him with little prompting, and Shoyuta could tell that finally seeing the kid was starting to help his husband recover from his panic attack. After a nudge, the blonde leaned in towards the kid and spoke his second words of the day. "Hey, little listener," he whispered, voice broken and cracked, so different that Shoyuta himself barely recognized it. That doesn't seem to affect the kid though, because the next words out of his mouth were, "Present Mike? Omigodi ramifavorite radio show ha standilistentiu everyday die can't bellaveri here dash." Hisashi was sufficiently alarmed by the mutterfest and interrupted the child mid-sentence. "Whoa, slow down there, little listener. Do you know where you are right now?" This brought forth a sniffle from the kid, and a small voice replied, "I'm in the hospital, and it's the doctor. She said that my MMW is dead." With that, the child started crying fully and clutched a small piece of fabric Shoyuta hadn't noticed before in his hands. "And now I can see the white and I shouldn't and I can't and make it stop dash." The fabric in the boy's hands began to glow, suddenly, greener and greener until the blankets were glowing too, and they glowed so brightly that Shoyuta couldn't help but close his eyes, preventing him from using his quirk. With a cry of anguish, the boy keeled over and Shoyuta forced his eyes open to cancel his quirk, hair lifting and swaying in the air. The nurse tugged him and Hisashi outside the room, leaving a young boy there to cry alone, but not before Shoyuta saw the blanket, previously on the bed, crumpled against the wall behind where Shoyuta had been sitting, with no explanation of how they got there. What? Shuta's head was still reeling from what the nurse said to him and Hisashi outside. So the kid was quirkless and blind, according to his medical records, and that was a terrible hand fate dealt him. But the kid was clearly not quirkless, he had just seen that, and if you deciphered his babbling from before, he probably wasn't quite blind anymore either. The two were probably connected, just no one knew how, yet. Shoyuta stared at his phone and sighed. He hadn't wanted to resort to this, but he didn't think he had a choice, now, not after the conversation he just had. His finger hovered over the send button before he finally pressed down. Me. Come down to Muzutofo Hospital. Me, there's someone you need to meet. Read 2:15 a.m. Nedzu, principal of UA, had seen many strange things in his lifetime. As a chimera who was one of very few animals to have a quirk, as well as being the head of the most prominent hero schools in the country, strange happenings were kind of par for the course. But never, in all his life, had he been summoned to the hospital in the early hours of the morning by his most ruthless teacher for no apparent reason. That was a new one. The chimera walked in through the double doors and strode confidently up to the front desk, asking for one Aizawa Shoyuta. From what he had seen of the news, Nedzu was betting that this had something to do with the villain attack Yamada had been involved in yesterday afternoon. Honestly, seeing how shaken up the normally excitable voice hero had been afterwards, it couldn't be anything else. Aizawa may act like he had no emotions, but his feelings for the blonde weren't so easily hidden. He cared for Yamada deeply, and Nedzu was sure that the issue was something to do with him. The receptionist directed him up toward the intensive care unit. Nedzu suppressed the shudder that went through him at those words. He was sure that both Aizawa and Yamada were fine, so why was he worrying so much? Actually, scratch that, he knew why. He didn't really want to know what had shaken up even the unflappable Eraserhead so much that he felt like he had to call in Nedzu. The elevator came to a stop. Midoriya Izuku had been through a lot in the last day. He had lost his mum, been badly injured, and now apparently had to go someplace to train his new quirk, and if that wasn't the biggest irony ever, he didn't know what was. All of it seemed to pale in comparison to when the doctors finally took the bandages off of his eyes. Apparently, they hadn't really been very badly injured at all, and after one of the doctors used their quirk on him, there really wasn't any need for his eyes to be covered anymore. Present Mike and his husband had left about 5 minutes before. Aizawa had said there was someone he wanted meet. As Kaken would say, that was cryptic as F, but Aizawa had seemed sincere, so there was that. As the bandages left his face, he saw the colors of the world around him. Suddenly, for the first time ever. That was when it hit him that all of this was real, that his mum was never coming back. Shoyuta walked back into Midoriya's hospital room to the sound of screams. It took nearly 15 minutes for Izuku to stop screaming. Shoyuta wasn't sure if that was because he had calmed down or because he'd run out of voice to scream with. Judging by the way the boy's eyes darted around the room, he was inclined to believe the latter. Regardless, he, Hizashi, and Nedzu were now sitting next to the kid's bedside, Nedzu especially looking terribly excited about this turn of events. The chimera was about to tell the kid the news, whether it was good or bad, Shoyuta didn't quite know yet, when the child turned towards them slightly, the first acknowledgement he'd given them all evening, and said, "Nedzu-sama, why are you an animal? Or at least I think you are. You look different from the other people here. Even the mutant ones. They're people with animal quirks, but you're more like an animal with a human quirk." This was all said in one breath, with no change in tone at all. It was, in all honesty, rather unnerving. Nedzu, for once, was taken aback, before laughing and agreeing that he was, in fact, an animal with a quirk. Shoyuta was still confused, however, so he leaned forward and said, "Midoriya, how did you know that about Nedzu?" The green-haired child tilted his head in confusion. "Why wouldn't I? He looks different from everyone else, even though everybody is really different. Like Aizawa-sama looks like a void, and Yamada-sama looks really loud, I think? I'm not sure if something can look loud." Shoyuta blanched. The kid had pretty much accurately described his quirk, as well as Hizashi's, just by looking at them. If there was any doubt in his mind that Izuku had a quirk, it was gone. In the back of his mind, he wondered when the kid had become Izuku in his head. He suspected it was when he turned around with so much world-weary pain in his eyes, too much for the small face they were held in. So how is it possible? How can a kid manifest what appears to be an extremely powerful quirk 3 years late, while possessing the extra toe joint and being diagnosed as quirkless? Yamada asked, leaning forward in his chair. Izuku saw, out of the corner of his eye, the mouse-slash-bear-slash-dog creature, Nedzu. His name was Nedzu, shift in his chair as well. He wasn't sure what to think of the chimera, but he couldn't fault him about being curious for the answer. Izuku was eager to find out too. Well, the quirk specialist began, we have reason to believe this isn't actually the first time young Midoriya here has manifested his quirk. You see, after x-raying his feet, we found that he has an extremely rare condition in which he has an extra toe joint in one foot and not in the other. People with the condition are no more likely to be quirkless with no extra toe joint in the first place. So he was actually, in all likelihood, misdiagnosed. Yes, that makes sense, but what do you mean he's already manifested his quirk? Aizawa asked, tilting his head. Izuku was honestly confused too. A lot of these terms were going straight over his head. Instead of answering his question, though, the specialist turned to Izuku. Midoriya, have you ever noticed yourself touching an object and feeling weirdly tired afterwards? Izuku was about to answer no, because what sort of weird question was that, when he abruptly remembered an incident, or several actually, when he'd been especially upset with Kaken and had suddenly felt really tired, invariably while clutching one of his All Might plushies. So he nodded his head, and the quirk specialist took that as her cue to continue. I believe that Izuku's quirk, which appears to be touch-based, had already manifested as a weak telekinesis type, but the right conditions were never met to activate it. That, and the stressful event of yesterday forced his quirk to mutate and become more powerful, hence the green light. So, what is his quirk? Aizawa asked. From what I've seen, it's an emitter-type quirk, in which two objects are touched by the user and linked together so that moving one object will also move the other. I'd have to observe more to be sure, but that seems to be the fundamental part of it. So, Midoriya, what would you like to name your new quirk? Izuku smiled, a fractured and broken smile he was sure, but still a smile, his first since learning the news of his mother's death. He remembered stories told by his bedside, of warlocks and witches and, sometimes, voodoo doll. Izuku's head was reeling. Not only had he found his quirk, but he was now being asked by the principal of UA if he would like the help of the school, the most prestigious hero school in Japan, no less, to master his new quirk, as a quirk mutating once already active was almost unheard of. Somewhere, in the back of his head, he could almost hear his mother's voice asking him why he was so happy with her gone. How could he be so happy when the cost of his quirk was her? He didn't hear it this time, though. Those voices wouldn't take over for a while. He stammered out his thanks to everyone in the room, as coherently as usual, while the adults looked on in amusement. 3 days later, the paperwork was signed, and Midoriya Izuku was officially a ward of Principal Nedzu and UA High School, with primary parental responsibilities going to Aizawa Shoyuta and Yamada Hisashi. The move to the dorm system definitely had nothing to do with Shoyuta, and the reason was definitely nothing to do with his least favorite problem child feeling more comfortable with staying on site, which was necessary for 3 reasons. His protection against any villains that might hold a grudge from the attack, for the volatility of his quirk, and because Shoyuta and Hisashi's apartment wasn't big enough for a child. He would have been taken in by someone else, but there was no one else Izuku trusted, really trusted, and no other teachers at the school were ready for a child. Nope. Definitely not. Regardless, Shoyuta now had the pleasure of making time for the problem child in and amongst his other duties as a pro-hero and teacher, because he and Hisashi had, somewhere along the way, agreed to take care of the kid. That meant that his and Hisashi's suite of rooms, something that every teacher had gotten upon the change, were adjacent to the problem child's with a connecting door, something that Shoyuta definitely wasn't happy about. Nope. Well, he supposed that it was probably a good thing. God knows what would happen if one of the other teachers at the school were given primary care of Izuku, someone like Namuri. Shoyuta shuddered. It wasn't very pleasant to think about. It was also probably a good thing that it was nearing the end of the summer holidays. It meant that his teaching responsibilities hadn't started yet, while still being able to move into their new UA apartment, and he could take his time to work out a sleeping schedule that allowed him more than an hour's sleep per night. Or day, he supposed. He never did sleep much during the night, between his jobs and his mercurial insomnia. That was the joy that was life. Aizawa-san. A timid pull of Shuta's shirt sleeve halted his train of thought. Izuku had come home, or rather, come to UA from the hospital a month ago, and he and Hisashi, that is, were still working up to Izuku calling them by less formal names. They were practically his parents now, so Shoyuta really wanted his problem child to stop calling him Aizawa-san. He knew in his head that the kid had just gone through extreme trauma and lost his mum, but it didn't stop his heart aching whenever Izuku called him by the honorific. Honestly, at this point he would settle for just Aizawa. Hey there, problem child. When he and Hisashi had first adopted Izuku, he hadn't called him by the nickname as he wasn't sure if it would upset him, but when he'd finally been too tired to function and had let it slip out, used it, Izuku laughed and said it probably suited him. It had been the first laugh Shoyuta had ever heard from him, and no, he definitely did not film it. You have no proof. Did you need something, Izuku? Shoyuta asked, bending down so he was the same height as the small greenette. And no, I wanted, Izuku trailed off into low, quiet mumbling. Smiling softly, Shoyuta circled his arms around his green bean, which was Hisashi's nickname that he may or may not have stolen, and lifted him off the ground. The child still struggled to ask for things, but he didn't shy away from physical contact. Shoyuta wasn't religious, but he thanked the Lord for that, and would often be able to better articulate his thoughts when hugged by one of his dads. What you want, Green Bean? We've told you, it's okay to ask us for things. We're taking care of you, and we want you to be happy. As he spoke, Shoyuta moved Izuku to his hip and walked into the kitchen, where Hisashi was making dinner. Can I talk to you and Hisashi-san for a minute? Hisashi, hearing that, immediately turned off the stove and zoomed over to the counter Shoyuta was leaning against. What is it, little listener? Izuku turned his head into Shuta's shoulder for a few seconds before seemingly gathering his courage and saying, would it be okay for me to, call you Dad and Pops? Shoyuta didn't think he'd ever felt happier in his life. Almost 7 years later, at the age of 14, Midoriya Izuku stood in front of the imposing gates of UA and took a deep breath. He had been training with his dads and Nedzu almost constantly since he had first worked out the implications of his quirk. It was an odd one, but his mum had died to give it to him and there was no way he was going to waste it. In the back of his head he registered that was probably an unhealthy attitude to have, but it was a long-held belief he'd had since waking up in that hospital bed horribly, horribly alone. It was the one idea his therapist had never been able to shake. Izuku's quirk worked a lot like the creepy witches' dolls from pre-quirk era movies. He could touch one object while touching another. Anything done to one object would affect the other. It sounded relatively simple, but it had some interesting side effects. See, from the moment Izuku was born, he was blind. He had never seen anything, ever, until that one morning 7 years ago when he opened his eyes and saw everything. Sometimes it felt like his whole existence was centered around the night he got his quirk, like his life had ended and begun, and if he was totally honest with himself, he didn't know whether if he could change the past he would. And that scared the CRP out of him. The most prominent side effect of his quirk was that it had given him sight. Or rather, another sense. He most commonly referred to it as sight, which is kind of what it was. It wasn't dependent of his eyes but was more like a sphere of awareness all around him. Everything was lit up in colors, from the vibrant neon of the grass to the dull brown of the packed soil. He still remembered the day when he worked out why as one of the fondest memories of his life. Dad! Dad! Izuku ran into his father's study with the speed of an incoming bullet train. Aizawa Shoyuta looked up from the newspaper he was holding to his son, eyes swimming with a familiar mixture of exasperation and love. Yes, problem child? I figured it out. My quirk sight thing. His dad leaned forward in his chair, eyes firmly fixed on his son. You did? How does it work then? It shows me how to link things. So, your clothes, he darted forward and touched his dad's t-shirt, and my clothes, he slapped a palm to his chest, are the same color and they're easier to link because they're both made of nylon. Izuku was snapped out of his reverie when he tripped over himself and was only saved from an embarrassing faceplant by a warm, bubbly, pink girl who slapped his shoulder and stopped his fall. It might have sounded like a weird description to anyone else, but while his sight may have lit up the world in vibrant reds and oranges and greens and every other color under the sun, The people were the best. Humanity shone with brightly patterned lights, often relating to their quirks. Dad looked like a black void, and Pops seemed to pulse with bright waves of sunshine. A small part of his brain wondered what a quirkless person would look like. Another part didn't want to know. The warm pink bubbly girl introduced herself as Uraraka Achiko before skipping off towards the main school building. Izuku dashed after her and made it into the auditorium before his Pops appeared to talk about the practical exam. The written exam had been the day before, and he'd thought that he'd done all right, all things considered. He zoned out a bit about 30 seconds and his parents had explained it to him enough times already. He had had the option to take the recommendation exam, but had decided to take the normal one instead to avoid accusations of favoritism. Besides, his quirk was more suited to fighting robots than a race. A strict fast blue boy from the row in front of him had just stood up, ranting about 4 robots rather than 3 or some other thing Izuku couldn't really be bothered to listen to until the boy rounded on him. "And you," he yelled in a way that suggested to Izuku that he had been ranting for quite a while now, "you have been staring off into space, not paying attention for the past 5 minutes. That is not appropriate behavior for someone who wants to be a hero." Shocked silence filled the hall, and Izuku whipped his head around to stare imploringly at his Pops, who cleared his throat and said, "Yes, well. Very good question. There are 4 robots on the cards because the last robot is a 0-pointer. It's worth 0 points. You should probably avoid it. Anyway, let's go take the exam." Yeah. Chatter resumed once again as people filed out of the auditorium. Izuku was about to leave too, but his Pops pulled him over to one side as the last of the prospective UA students left the room. "Hey, Green Bean," he said, probably with a look of concern on his face. That's the only major hurdle he has to get around with his sight, really. He can't see people's faces, they're all one color to him. The only exception to this rule was the one memory he had of his mum, smiling down at him right before she died, but he tried not to think about that. "Hey Pops. Look, I'm fine really. I honestly wasn't paying attention. You guys have lectured me on the exam enough times now." Izuku smiled, going for levity. He could tell it didn't quite work but pulled his arm out of his Pops and turned towards the exit. "Bye, Pops. I really gotta go now, see you later. I love you." He could faintly hear the answering shout of, "Good luck." He made it to the testing ground with only a minute to go. While breathing for breath, almost bent double, because he's been training with his parents for ages but the sprint from the auditorium to the grounds is long, okay? He spotted warm pink bubbly Uraraka out of the corner of his eye. He was about to head over and say thanks for the tripping debacle earlier. He really has to be less clumsy, honestly, when strict fast blue from earlier steps in front of him, blocking his path. He tries to duck past, but strict fast blue stops him again. He was about to ask what the problem is, when strict fast blue answers for him. "You were about to go and talk to that girl over there, were you not? I have to advise that you do not distract anyone before the exam. We are all trying hard here, unlike you." Izuku was about to walk away, but when he heard those words out of strict fast blue's mouth, he bristled. He turned away and walked in the other direction, but not before throwing over his shoulder, "I don't think insulting other examinees is very good form either." He sees strict fast blue hunch his shoulders and turn away before he moves out of range, and not 30 seconds later Pop's voice came over the loudspeakers. As soon as "go" was shouted, he was off, Dad having long ago drilled into his head that there are no countdowns in the field. Examinees shot past him left and right, a blur of color and sound as robots got destroyed and shrapnel flew everywhere. The robots looked, to him, like running lines of code that was unmistakably technology. The TV in his parents' room looked the same, if a different shade of blue. Izuku paused running to grab a small piece of shrapnel off the ground before scaling the nearest building. He cast his sight out wide, capturing every robot in the vicinity. One of the very first things Izuku had realized when he arrived in the arena was that all the robots were the very same color, meaning they were probably quirk created. That, in turn, meant that he could do something very special with those robots. Holding 2 pieces of robot, one in each hand, Izuku ensnared every robot that he could sense nearby, and smashed the shrapnel he was holding together. Ida Tenya thought his practical exam was going okay. In his humble opinion, they were about 7 minutes in, and if his maths was correct, then he had around 39 points. He was really glad he'd gotten Tensei to help him practice. Who knows where he'd be without that? As he smashed his leg through another one-pointer's head, he found his thoughts drawn back to the strange, green-haired boy from earlier. He truly hadn't meant to offend, but there was just something about the boy's blasé attitude that drove him up the wall. Heroes were meant to always try their best, yet this boy seemed to think that he could coast through the exam without giving his all. Suddenly, quite without warning, every single undamaged robot on the street in front of him began to glow neon green, and one by one, rise into the air, gaining speed before smashing back down to Earth, on top of other robots no less. Tenya could see the boy from earlier on top of a nearby building, his form glowing that same caustic green. Maybe, he thought, staring at the now empty street he was standing on, maybe that kid was strong enough to be blasé. It wasn't a pleasant thought. A bead of sweat ran down Izuku's temple as he picked up another robot and threw it down. Really, he thought, he was just lucky that all the robots were exactly the same. It meant that he had only needed to touch one robot and the rest were all accessible to him. Right now, the only color fully prominent in his vision was the clinical blue of the robots and the fine, white lines that showed him how far to move the shrapnel in his hand to destroy the robot. It was what always happened when he was using his quirk. The other colors faded, whatever he was linking grew brighter and thin white lines crisscrossed his vision, providing a frame of reference for distances that always reminded him of an architecture's drawing. It showed him how far to move one thing to move the other and was honestly one of his favorite parts of his quirk. A faint rumble in the distance snapped his focus away from the robots in front as he beheld, with no small amount of fear, the robot behind. The zero-pointer had emerged. Recap from last chapter. A faint rumble in the distance snapped his focus away from the robots in front as he beheld, with no small amount of fear, the robot behind. The zero-pointer had emerged. The robot was huge. Growing up in and around UA's campus meant it was hard to surprise Izuku anymore. But seriously, he was going to have a word with Majima-sensei because while he was all for go big or go home, the zero-pointer was giant. It towered over the buildings of the testing ground, and with every step the ground shook. He was about to move away, like all the sensible, non-suicidal teenagers who were currently running in the opposite direction, when something caught at the end of his vision. Something warm, pink and bubbly. That wasn't moving. Demand it, Uraraka, he thought, even as he turned around and started in the other direction, hopping from building to building. Yagi Toshinori was no stranger to strength. After all, he was the #1 hero, the symbol of peace, and now, a teacher at UA High School. However, nothing had quite prepared him for Midoriya Izuku. He knew of the boy, he was Aizawa and Yamada's kid, and he had practically grown up around UA. But then the kid went and destroyed an entire street of robots in the span of a minute. Toshinori had seen a lot of crazy quirks out in the world, but sitting in the observation room with his soon-to-be colleagues and watching a 14-year-old boy cut through robots almost as fast as he would be able to was sobering. He heard a cackle of laughter from behind him, and swiveled around in time to see Principal Nedzu press a large red button displaying a skull and crossbones, which was really macabre, and Toshinori would have said something, but he might have been a teensy, tiny bit scared of Nedzu and didn't want to incur his wrath, which released the zero-pointer. He watched as examinees fled. He watched as one girl, who he would later find out to be called Uraraka Achiko, fell under a pile of rubble. He watched as kids ran past her, leaving her to try and free herself. And he watched as Midoriya Izuku hesitated on top of a building on the other side of the arena before running towards the robot. Toshinori's first thought was that Midoriya had gone back for the glory. It wouldn't be the first time someone with a powerful quirk had done something pointless to prove themselves. This train of thought was derailed, however, when Midoriya purposely stood in front of Uraraka. Not since making young Tagata his successor had Toshinori seen such flawless selflessness, and he wondered in the back of his mind whether, in another life, he would have chosen Midoriya instead. He wasn't quite sure what to make of that thought. Uraraka Achiko had decided that she was officially an idiot. Her exam was going fine until she, like an idiot, got herself trapped under rubble right in the path of the zero-pointer. And she had already pretty much exhausted her quirk reserves, so she couldn't rescue herself, and everyone else was too busy running away to try and rescue her. Which had led to her current situation, trapped under a bunch of rubble less than 10 meters away from a giant robot, unable to free herself and hoping that the UA faculty would be able to reach her before the robot could. The UA faculty were actually still in the observation room, dithering between relief that the problem child was about to deal with the issue and panic that the problem child was about to deal with the issue. Of course, just when Achiko was about to resort to dislocating her hand in order to free herself was when the boy she had saved from tripping earlier came bounding out of nowhere to stand between her and the robot. She wondered if that was karma. She was still nervous, of course, because Green, well, she had to call him something, was only a little bit taller than her and the robot was around the size of a 4-story building, but then for some reason he bent down to pick a small chunk of robot off of the ground. It took her a while to realize that it was actually a piece of the 0-pointer. Of course, that's when he started to glow. Midoriya Izuku had done a lot of stupid things in his life, but confronting the largest robot he had ever seen with half of his reserves depleted was without question one of the stupidest. One of the largest drawbacks of his quirk was that forming links used up his vitality. Izuku always had a mental tally of his reserves, and after destroying all those robots it was down to about half. Which, ordinarily, would have been fine, except now he was trying to take down a robot that would usually take most of his stamina to move, and overusing his quirk had consequences. At best, it would drain all his stamina and he wouldn't be able to move. At worst, it would start draining his life force. However, that had only happened once before, and re-evaluating his reserves, Izuku was sure he could do it. That was what UA was all about, right? Plus Ultra. So, having made that probably very stupid decision, Izuku crouched down and closed his eyes, which had no actual bearing on his vision, but always helped him concentrate, and scan the area for the exact shade of running code blue that matched the robot. If he was going to do this, nothing but the absolute best connection would do, and it was easiest to link something to itself. Back in the observation room, Toshinori wondered loudly about what the kid was doing. Nemuri elbowed him and told him to shut up and enjoy the show. Shoyuta questioned his life decisions and wondered why he ended up with the amazingly perfect, yet monumentally stupid problem child. Hizashi looked like Christmas had come early. Having found a small chunk of robot, Izuku turned around and vaulted up the nearest building. He made a mental note to thank his dad for teaching him parkour. Shoyuta was questioning himself as to why he had taught his kid parkour. Running tentatively across the rooftops, because the ground was still shaking. Why, Majima-sensei, why? Izuku reached the robot's hand. Steeling himself, he reached out and touched it. The world became green. And the robot flew. It landed with a thud just outside of the testing grounds, and with the last of his strength, he used the piece of rock clutched in his hand to lift the rubble off of Uraraka before sliding to the ground boneless. Unfortunately, the ground happened to be 2 stories below him. The last thing he saw was the heel-white worried glow of Recovery Girl, who carted him off to the infirmary. He received the statistics later: 2 fractured ribs, a broken hand and extreme quirk exhaustion. His parents grounded him for a week. After congratulating him, of course. So it wound up that he was lying in his bed, browsing on his phone 1 week later when the UA letter finally came. His pops sidled so slowly into the room that he almost didn't notice, but his color of yellow loud caring love caught on Izuku's senses and he looked up. "Hey there, Green Bean," Pops said, bounding cheerfully now that he no longer had to be silent. Your letter came." Dad slouched in slowly after him, looking tired as usual. "How you managed to be so cheerful so early I'll never know." Izuku couldn't resist the opportunity for a bit of teasing. "Well, some of us don't spend all night at the cat cafe." His dad turned around and hit his head against the wall. "That was one time." One. His husband and child both raised disbelieving eyebrows at him and he just groaned pitifully. "Anyway, you said my letter came? Let me see. Pops dutifully handed him a letter, and Izuku tore it open quickly. The letter was long, almost 3 pages, but the only thing that mattered to him was the words in bold at the bottom of the last page. Izuku was moving into the student dorms today. Which ordinarily wouldn't be a problem, but today was the 5th of April, which meant that he was moving into the student dorms on the 5th of April. Because he already lived on site. Izuku wanted to scream. He had never once complained about living on UA's campus. He was near heroes. How could that not be cool? But he hadn't been living with Dad and Pops for very long before he started wondering why. They put him off for a while with half-baked excuses like, it's for work, or, because it's more convenient, but he always came back to the topic, eventually. He remembered the day that they had finally sat him down and explained. It was 3 weeks after his 8th birthday, it was raining outside and it was the year anniversary of his mother's death. He remembered how he twisted his plush in his hands as his parents explained that the girl Izuku had accidentally, he tried to, it wasn't an accident because he was so angry, killed that day in the mall was the daughter of a famed crime boss. He remembered how Dad crouched in front of him, telling him of death threats and warnings that got so bad that they were forced to relocate to UA. He remembered how Pops had rubbed his back as he sobbed and soothed him as he learned how the rest of the students and faculty had followed them on to the school grounds. He remembered how he cried himself to sleep, his parents' worried faces swimming above him. So upon learning that he was to move into the UA dorms on the 5th of April, Izuku wanted to rage and scream about how wrong this was. Bad things happened on the 5th of April. He did not want to start off his high school experience with a bad day. And the 5th of April was always a bad day. He ran out of his room and took the stairs 2 at a time, bursting into the kitchen, the piece of paper clutched tightly in one hand. He was about to burst in and demand what the hell this was supposed to be when he heard his Pops singing along to some nonsense on the radio and suddenly slowed and breathed in and out, calming down. Now that his initial terror from the situation had lessened, he could see that the concern was a bit silly. It was just a date, even if his subconscious told him that it was bad. This was a stupid thing to cry to his parents over. It would be fine, he would be fine. He just needed to stay calm. When his dad burst in through the door not 5 seconds later, a furious scowl on his face, Izuku cursed his terrible luck and the date. The 5th of April was always a bad day. Shoyuta was annoyed. Nope, scratch that, he was angry. He was very angry. Because someone had decided to take the prime example of what heroes should not do if they want to stay alive and given the man a position teaching at UA. All Might didn't even have a teaching license. Shoyuta slammed his front door open, violently grabbed a mug of tea and sat down angrily at the kitchen table, burying his face in his hands. Standing at the stove, Hizashi considered his husband's actions with a growing expression of concern. Shoyuta snorted at the unasked question and said, someone decided it would be a good idea to give All Might a teaching position. He's taking foundational heroics and dash. Bang. Startled, Shoyuta nearly fell off his chair. It took him a good 30 seconds to realize that Izuku had tumbled through the hall door he was leaning on in shock. The next words spoken were Izuku's very quiet, very heartfelt, "What the F?" Shoyuta understood why he was upset, of course. He remembered the event that turned his son against the #1 hero like it was yesterday, not least because it started with Shoyuta finding him crying in a broom closet at HeroCon. There were sounds coming from the closet. Pitiful whines and sniffles that clearly belonged to someone in great pain. Shoyuta nudged the door open slowly, ready to help the distressed kid. The crying was too high-pitched to be anything but a child, only for his motions to screech to a stop as soon as he realized that it was his son crying in the broom closet. He moved carefully, as one would do when trying not to startle a wild animal, before sitting down next to his kid and slinging an arm around him. "Izuku? What's wrong, Green Bean?" Izuku turned into his side and asked quietly, so softly that Shoyuta could barely hear him, "Dad? Can I be a hero?" Shoyuta was confused but immediately shot back, "Of course you can." When no reply was forthcoming, Shoyuta asked softly, "Izuku? Did something happen?" Even as he said it, Shoyuta could feel his metaphorical hackles raising, starting to understand the situation. Izuku's next words were even softer than the last ones, breathed quietly into Shuta's side. Even though I'm blind? Of course you can be a hero, Izuku. Blind or not, you're going to be the best hero ever." Shoyuta had never asked, But the week after the incident, his problem child had ripped down all his All Might merch and asked to start training with his dad. Needless to say, All Might was not a very welcome presence in the Aizawa Yamada household. Who wants to let that idiot near impressionable children? Izuku asked furiously. Does he even have a teaching license? Shoyuta winced at the venom in his son's voice but decided that it was probably warranted. Heck, he was probably just as annoyed at the situation. No, All Might does not have a teaching license. Then who let him teach? Hisashi broke in, eyes widening as he worked out the answer to his own question. Both parents glanced towards their son, wondering whether or not it would be worth letting him know. Eventually Shoyuta broke the silence and said, haltingly, Nedzu. Izuku, surprisingly, did not erupt with rage, but immediately started walking towards the door. Shoyuta groaned and went to pull Izuku back with his capture weapon, but without missing a beat Izuku ducked underneath it and left the house, pulling his shoes on as he went. I'll be back in an hour. Izuku called. Me and Nedzu are going to have words. Shoyuta thumped his head down on the desk as Hisashi started laughing. The beast starred. Nedzu didn't entirely know what he was expecting from his day, but an angry gremlin child bursting into his office definitely wasn't it. He was about to greet Izuku cheerfully when he registered the angry scowl on the teen's face and wisely decided to keep quiet. He predicted an explosion in 3, 2, 1. You let All Might teach? There it was. Nedzu tried to explain himself, only to be cut off again by the Green Menace, and he was a menace, there was no doubt about it. One shouldn't be fooled by the child's excitable personality and baby-faced cuteness. Izuku was a gremlin child and Nedzu did not give out that title lightly, saying, "What on earth came over you, Nedzu?" making the Chimera wince. Nedzu had been tutoring Izuku for all the time that the child had lived at UA, and he had been granted the title of Uncle 5 months in. For Izuku to be dropping that now was a very, very bad sign. Izuku was about to continue with his rant, but Nedzu halted him with a raised paw. All Might, while he may not be totally qualified to teach, he is still the symbol of peace, little gremlin. I have already asked Aizawa to monitor him for the first few weeks. Satisfied at the lack of outburst from the little gremlin, as Nedzu had christened him after one particularly spectacular April Fool's Day prank 5 years ago, he was about to go back to his long overdue paperwork when he caught a glimpse of cunning in Izuku's eyes. He knew teaching the little gremlin would come back to haunt him one day. So, Uncle Nedzu, the Chimera both sighed in relief that the honorific was back and winced at the cunning, smug tone it was set in. What's your actual reason for hiring All Might? And we both know his public status isn't part of it. Nedzu knew his ruse had been spotted but decided to smile innocently and try to deflect. It'd make wonderful practice for his student. Why, little gremlin, I have no idea what you're trying to insinuate. Izuku simply tilted his head to the side, made some quick motions with his hands and sighed. So which villain was so important that it required hiring on that buffoon to teach? Nedzu grinned wickedly and said, well, I could explain myself, but I think it would be more apt if I summoned over someone close to All Might to explain instead. Yagi Toshinori wasn't exactly sure why his new boss was summoning him back to his office at 10:30 in the morning when he had been there not 30 minutes prior, but he was sure it could be nothing good. Especially when he was summoned in his civilian form. So when he tentatively slid the door to Nedzu's office open, he was expecting to be yelled at, or the police to be present or something of an equally sinister nature. What he wasn't expecting was for his terrifying, no, Toshinori was not scared of Nedzu, you can't prove anything, boss to be sitting calmly behind his desk and for the only other person in the room to be the highest scorer from the entrance exam, Midoriya Izuku. He also wasn't expecting them to be involved in a very serious conversation about tea, of all things. Nedzu-san? You wanted to see me? The Chimera in question glanced up from his conversation just as Midoriya turned around and gave him a grin. Yes, of course, Yagi-san. Midoriya here dash. Whatever Nedzu had to say was cut off by Midoriya's shocked whisper of, All Might? Blanching slightly, Toshinori looked down at himself to conclude that, yes, he was still in his civilian form as Midoriya turned to Nedzu and asked, slightly incredulously, You said it would be an associate of All Might, not All Might himself. Those words finally jolted Toshinori out of his funk long enough to try and stammer out excuses, to which Midoriya rolled his eyes and said, "Please. My quirk lets me the energies of things, and your aura is exactly the same as All Might's, albeit dimmer." Abruptly, Midoriya winced and turned back towards Nezu. "I'm assuming this all has to do with the huge gaping hole in Yagi-san's stomach?" Toshinori was about to ask how he knew about that, but Midoriya seemed to sense the question coming and arched a brow. The quirk thing. However, he still didn't know why he had been summoned to Nezu's office, or what it had to do with All for One. "Nezu-san, with all due respect, I still don't know why I'm here, exactly." "Ah yes, how silly of me. You see, Midoriya-kun here was asking about the point of hiring you when you do not possess a teaching license, to which I replied that the reason was that you are the #1 hero." He did not buy this, of course, and managed to deduce that it was to do with a villain of some kind. "I of course then decided to call you here to explain in person." Toshinori just nodded, still slightly in shock, before explaining the intricacies of One for All for One, his injury and his search for a successor, whom he had found in young Mirio. By the end of it all, Midoriya seemed both intrigued and frustrated, though neither of those emotions were focused on him, and so he took the opportunity to back out of the room, leaving the Chimera and, what seemed to be, his student behind. He got the feeling that neither of them liked him much. Nezu was waiting. He could see the anger growing on Izuku's face and wasn't entirely sure he was going to make it out of this encounter unscathed. Nevertheless, he would face his impending demise with courage, which was a scenario that seemed to be growing more likely every passing second, in direct correlation with Izuku's anger. He was so screwed. Finally, Izuku broke the silence with a lethally calm. "So, Uncle Nezu, no, Nezu did not gulp. You have no proof. Let me get this straight. In order to apprehend a centuries-old cryptid with a godlike quirk, whom I'm gonna assume is not actually dead, you decided to hire the target of said cryptid to a school. A place that he is in no way qualified to work at and in which he may now come under fire from the aforementioned cryptid. Said cryptid was also, and still may be, the ruler of a criminal empire, so even if he was dead by some lucky chance his associates will come after All Might anyway. Does that sound about right?" All of this was said with a very level tone, perfectly calmly. Nezu decided to reevaluate his earlier statement. He was totally, utterly and irretrievably F-ed. The last time Nezu had seen Izuku this angry was when his friend was subjected to quirk discrimination. That time around he'd sued the school in question for $500,000. He was so screwed. But as Nezu did with all things life threw his way, he would face his end with bravado. "You see, little gremlin, you are forgetting one very important fact. Yagi Toshinori has already ceded his quirk, for better or for worse, to Dagata Mirio. He needs guidance on how to use his new quirk, and whether we like it or not, All Might is his best chance. Not to mention the fact that by all accounts this All for One knows the history of One for All, and if a third year suddenly developing a quirk doesn't tip him off as to who All Might's successor is, I don't know what will, and the school may very well come under fire anyway." At this explanation, Izuku looked slightly more thoughtful than angry, and Nezu thanked his lucky stars. "May I offer an alternative solution, Uncle Nezu? By my estimation, All Might's only job at this school is to teach Tagata, so why don't you make that his only job?" Nezu said nothing, only pet his head in silent question. "What I mean is, hire Yagi Toshinori, not All Might. Tell the students he is a quirk expert hired by the school to tutor Tagata in the intricacies of the new mutation in his quirk." Nezu smiled, pleased. "But how would we explain the sudden decrease in All Might's work hours?" "Well, we won't need to," was the reply, "because as I understand it, All Might can only work for 3 hours a day, yes? Just have him come in as Yagi once a week before his patrol, and if stuff does go down at the school, it won't hurt to have the #1 on speed dial." Nezu summoned All Might back into the room to discuss the changes. Contrary to popular belief, Hisashi wasn't the crazy one in his family. This point was perfectly illustrated when Izuku, his little green bean, came back through the door after talking to Nezu with a manic smile on his face. 8 years of living with the kid had pretty much made him give up trying to convince Izuku out of even the craziest of his crazy plans. Hisashi figured that if it didn't harm anyone, it was probably fine. The April Fool's Day prank had made him amend that rule to include the mental health of those involved. He was pretty sure that power loaders still had nightmares about that incident. He didn't blame him, honestly. In light of this, when Izuku came back through the door with a smile that would send any sane person running for their lives, Hisashi simply groaned and finished serving up breakfast before yelling, normally, for Shoyuta to leave the cats alone and get downstairs now. It took all of 2 seconds for Shoyuta to get downstairs and recognize the look on Izuku's face. "What did you do now, problem child?" Izuku bounced happily on the ball of his feet and answered, "I got All Might fired." Hisashi choked on his tea. "You what?" He was so surprised that he said it using his quirk, and only Aizawa's quick thinking saved him from denting the wall again. Izuku stared at him, like he couldn't work out what Hisashi was confused about. "I got All Might fired, Pops." "Well, I say I got him fired, but technically I got him fired as All Might then rehired as Yagi Toshinori. Does that mean I still got him fired? I mean technically twirled because dash." "Izuku." Shoyuta snapped his fingers in front of Izuku's face. "You're muttering again." "Ah." Izuku rubbed the back of his neck self-consciously. "Thanks, Dad." About a year ago, Izuku had come back from tutoring with Nezu wearing an odd frown on his face. Apparently his mumble storms were revealing his strategy to his opponents, and Nezu had told him, as homework, to figure out a solution to this problem. Shoyuta was the one to suggest sign language, but Hisashi was the one to teach it to him. A year later, and Izuku still mumbled in sign, but every once in a while, he would do so out loud too. He had asked his parents to remind him when he started doing it, to try and break him out of the habit. Hisashi was pulled out of his thoughts by Shoyuta thumping his head down on the desk for the second time this morning. No, he wasn't counting what gave you that idea, and saying, "I suppose we have to start moving your stuff now, problem child," in a tone that sounded disgruntled, but was. Actually, if you had known Shoyuta long enough, sad. Hisashi also happened to know that Shuta's head was on the desk to hide the fact that he was crying. Half an hour later, they had relocated to Izuku's new dorm room on the second floor of the 1A Heights Alliance building, along with what felt like several thousand boxes, which had been packed the week beforehand. As they placed down the last box, Hisashi worked up the courage to ask the question he had been wondering about since Izuku had come back through the door this morning. "Hey, Greenbean? I have a question for you, and if you don't want to answer you don't have to, but why did you get All Might fired?" It was no secret that his son didn't like All Might. Shoyuta had told him about Hirocon, but there was a difference between not liking someone and getting them fired. Almost immediately Hisashi saw Izuku's shoulders stiffen as he hunched in on himself and rushed to apologize. The memory was clearly not a good one, but was cut off by Izuku's reply. He's not responsible enough to teach people, Pops." Izuku scrubbed a hand over his face and sighed. "It was the Hirocon when I was 9. You remember? Anyway, All Might was there, and I asked for an autograph or something, I don't even remember, and I had my cane with me that day. You know how it's hard to focus with crowds, and I guess I wasn't looking at his face or something, and he worked out that I'm blind, and then I said that I wanted to be hero, and he told me that it was an admirable goal but I should be realistic. And I get it, I do. Having a fully blind hero would be a problem. But he just butted in and destroyed a kid's dreams without knowing the full story. And Izuku trailed off and Hisashi enveloped him in a hug while looking meaningfully at Shoyuta, who was glaring. He got it, of course. One of the very first things they had learned while raising their son was that you never, ever tell a traumatized child that they can't achieve something, especially if that thing relates to the trauma in the first place, which in Izuku's case was absolutely true. Hisashi suddenly had an urge to punch the number 1 hero in the face. Or maybe rupture his eardrums. He wasn't sure which yet. Midoriya Izuku, after his decidedly not great but better than usual day on the 5th of April, had settled into dorm life quite happily. The other students would start moving in on the 15th. Originally, he had thought that it was a ridiculous margin of time, but he was now grateful for the fact that he knew his way around the dorm and had been given enough time to unpack his stuff properly. In all honesty, that was probably his Uncle Nedzu's doing. He knew that unfamiliar places made Izuku jittery. His peace would soon be shattered, however, as the 15th of April was the day after tomorrow and students would be pouring in. Sighing, Izuku pulled back from his desk and started the trek to his parents' apartment in the teacher's building for dinner. Ida Tenya had been very glad to learn that he was moving on to UA's campus on the very first day possible. After all, that meant he could better prepare for the school year and meet his classmates. He had made sure to wake up extra early, 5 in the morning, and make it to UA for 7. Tensei helped him set up his room, while complaining about how many bookcases do you have, really Tenya my back is dying, before leaving him with a cup of hot cocoa to head out on patrol. All of which meant that Tenya was very confused when a very disheveled green-haired boy came downstairs at 9 o'clock, dressed in pajamas, of all things. Clearly the boy was confused too, because he muttered something under his breath before dashing back upstairs. Tenya shrugged and went back to his cocoa, wondering why he seemed so familiar. It was only when the greenette came back downstairs 15 minutes later, in tracksuit bottoms and a hoodie, that Tenya realized where he'd recognized him from. This was the boy from the entrance exam. "When did you get here, if you don't mind me asking?" he found himself saying. "Damn it, brain, where did you go?" "Only I got here at 7 and was sure I was the first one here." The question seemed to make the boy slightly uncomfortable, but Tenya got a reply of, "Yesterday," and was intrigued. "Yesterday? I thought the dorms only opened today?" Tenya asked, confused. Did he mess up the date? "Extenuating circumstances," the greenette said, but didn't elaborate, and only then did Tenya realize that he didn't know the name of this boy. "I am extremely sorry. I have not introduced myself. My name is Ida Tenya. It is a pleasure to meet you. Midoriya Izuku." Tenya was about to try and strike up conversation with the newly named Midoriya when the doors of the building slide open with a soft whoosh to reveal a girl with her brown hair curled into a bob. Almost immediately his companions straightened up and grinned at the new arrival. "Hiya there, Uraraka-san. Welcome to Class 1A. Uraraka laughed and moved through the open door to greet Midoriya. "Hey, Midoriya-san, was it? Thanks for saving me from the zero-pointer." She turned to Ida. "I'm Uraraka Achiko. And you are?" "Ida Tenya," he replied, noticing that her stuff was still in a heap by the door. "Would you like some assistance with moving your things up to your dorm room?" Uraraka laughed again. She seemed to be a very bubbly person, and accepted the help of both Tenya and Midoriya. Her dorm was on the 4th floor, and it took several trips to get everything upstairs, through which the three of them struck up conversation. Midoriya, however, refused to look at Tenya or Uraraka while speaking or being spoken to, preferring to look straight ahead, and it slowly began to grate on Tenya's nerves. Rudeness was not becoming of a hero. He must correct this flaw in his classmates' attitude, for the good of the world. "Midoriya-san," Tenya said, in his best teacher-y voice, complete with arm motions that Tensei always said looked odd but he ended up doing anyway. "I cannot help but notice that you have not been looking at us while conducting conversation. I feel that I must address this as rudeness is not becoming of a hero." At Tenya's overly passionate declaration, Midoriya seemed to start and turn around, frowning. "I wasn't." Suddenly, he slapped his palm to his forehead and the noise echoed down the corridor, making both of his companions flinch. "Oh, Sirpi, I totally wasn't, was I? Diamine. I'm really sorry, I completely forgot to orientate myself. I'm such an idiot, sometimes, sorry." Hesitantly, Uraraka spoke up from beside Ida, saying, "What do you mean, Midoriya-san? Did you not notice?" Midoriya laughed, awkwardly, and silence filled the corridor. Izuku really wasn't planning on telling people his whole backstory right off the bat. He was hoping that that whole awkward conversation would wait until at least the first week of school. But no, he had to go and be a dumba and out himself on the very first day. Idiot. Although, he supposed he didn't have to tell them everything right off the bat, did he? Pleased with his solution, Izuku proceeded to tell them the bare minimum he needed to explain his actions, which was pretty much just the intricacies of his quirk, sight, the 360 degrees perception, and the energy-based color vision. By the end of his explanation, Uraraka was bouncing on her toes, and Ida had slammed himself down into a 90 degrees bow. I am deeply apologetic. I should not have made assumptions, and I am very sorry. Izuku managed to fend off Ida's apologies before Uraraka couldn't contain herself anymore and said, bubbly as always, "That's so cool. What do we look like?" "Well," Izuku replied, "you look kinda warm, pink and bubbly, but also floaty. It's hard to describe." Ida looked strict, fast and blue. After an appropriate amount of time oohing and awing over Izuku's quirk, they all returned to their rooms. Izuku was about to settle down at his desk and get some work done when he noticed a very interesting person snag on the edge of his sight. This boy's energy was really cool, actually. He was like a lonely, angry explosion, rupturing in shades of orange. Wait a minute. Angry explosions. Sirbi. He thought he was done with hard conversations for the day. Bakugo Katsuki was going to be the best hero the world has ever seen. Of course, this was not a new thought. He'd been thinking it for years, but it had never seemed quite as concrete as it did now, staring up at the building that was going to be his home for the next 3 years, 1A Heights Alliance. Lugging his heavy suitcase behind him, Katsuki moved through the sliding doors and took a brief moment to thank the gods for the fact that he had been able to dump his parents at the front gate. He cared about them, of course he did, but they were so much sometimes. Perusing the map he had been given of the dorms, he strode, read, stomped, into the elevator and pressed the button for the 4th floor, determined to get settled into his room as fast as possible, then hit the gym. He wanted to punch something, D-Nit. A small part of his mind thanked his dad for reminding him to pack his exercise stuff. Then promptly forgot that thought. Bakugo Katsuki didn't thank anyone for anything. An hour later he had unpacked all of his and was getting ready to hit some unsuspecting punch bags when there was a knock on his door. Katsuki, being the graceful and suave person he was, completely ignored it, for the 5 seconds it took for the stranger to knock again. And again. Growling, he got to his feet and wrenched the door open. On the other side stood a mysterious figure in a huge blue hoodie that gave away nothing about who they were, only that they were really quite short. And now Katsuki was said, who did this piece of think they were, to march up to his door and interrupt his exercise? "What do you want, Iva?" he spat, body tense with annoyance. Leveling his best death stare at his visitor, he waited for them to F off. He really needed to punch something. "Hello, Bakugo," the figure replied, unfazed. This made Katsuki slightly less annoyed. Someone that could stand up to his ultimate death glare, patent pending, without even flinching was probably worth keeping around. "We need to talk." Katsuki laughed incredulously. "What the F? I'm not going anywhere with your effing creepy A." The person sighed. "Look, Bakugo, I would tell you who I am, but I really don't know if you would blow up the dorm building or not. So just come with me for a minute, please? I promise that I don't want to hurt you. Just talk. Is that too much to ask?" Alarm bells started ringing in Katsuki's mind. This knew his name and his quirk, apparently. While this information might have made any normal person flee, Katsuki was most definitely not normal, and there was no way that this idiot could hurt him. With this in mind, Katsuki shrugged, straightened up from his position against the doorframe, and followed his mystery visitor downstairs and out the front doors of the dorm building. The turned into a side alleyway, which screamed bad news to Katsuki, because he was cocky, not suicidal. He was about to turn back and make a tactical retreat to the dorms when the figure lifted their hood and all of Katsuki's higher thought processes ground to a halt. "Deku." Izuku had been debating what to do about the Bakugo issue since his childhood friend had shown up at the dorms an hour ago. Honestly, until then Izuku had pretty much forgotten about the blonde. After all the that had gone down around his adoption, a 7-year-old child pushing him around a bit didn't even rank on his worst experiences of my life list. Yes, he actually had one of those. 3 guesses as to what was number 1. Bakugo seemed to be as surprised to see Izuku as Izuku was to see him, if the literal step backwards. And what the hell was that about? Izuku thought that only happened in movies, and gasp were anything to go by. Izuku raised his hand in greeting, "Yo Bakugu. Long time no see." Katsuki was prepared for a lot of things stepping into that alleyway. A fight, which he would win spectacularly of course, was the most likely option, but he was ready for all possible scenarios, up to and including his attempted kidnapping by aliens. It could happen. Stop judging him. Midoriya Izuku being at UA was not one of those scenarios. It just seemed so far out of the realm of possibility after his repeated rejections of Katsuki's attempts to reach out. And that stung. Katsuki reaching out to apologize to someone was like the moon being made of cheese or All Might not being to number one hero. Almost impossible to imagine. He hadn't had a choice at first. In the aftermath of Anti-Inkos, God, he couldn't even think it without wanting to cry, what a effing idiot. His parents had found about his less than favorable treatment of Deku Izuku. They had sat him down and told him, in no uncertain terms, one universal truth. Heroes didn't hurt people. And he'd known it wasn't a good thing to do at the time. GD Nit but Izuku was so weak and quirkless and easy to pick on and it had just happened. But having the stuff he had done spelled out in front of him, he had been a S-Tai kid. So his parents made him write a letter to apologize. Which he did. And Izuku ignored him. So another letter was written. Then a third. And then Katsuki was writing them without input from his parents because he had been a FING idiot and he needed to apologize DNIT. All of them were ignored. Single. What? And now this decides to show up? Calling him Bakugu? And if Katsuki heard his last name out of Izuku's mouth one more time he might scream. And acting like they barely knew each other? The hurt and the rage and the pain swirled inside Katsuki's chest, and he did what he did best when confronted with emotions he didn't like. He lashed out. He charged forward, explosion gathering in his fist, towards Izuku. He barely had time to think, what am I doing? I thought was FN better than this S? Before Izuku moved. He twisted out of the way of Katsuki's punch, touched 5 fingers to the back of Katsuki's neck, pulled one of Katsuki's hairs out. And what the hell was up with that? Before Katsuki was hit with this unexpected feeling of weight that pulled him down until he was lying on the ground, winded. All in the span of 2 seconds. As he hauled himself upright to lean against the wall, Katsuki had only one thought. This was not the child he had known 8 years ago. Izuku was conflicted. He had grabbed a strand of Kaken Bakugu's hair so if the blonde so much as looked like he was going to attack, Izuku would be ready for him. As the fighting was no longer a problem, Izuku was left with 2 options. Leave Kabakugu alone because he was clearly not ready to have a mature conversation with him. Talk to the guy and see what happens. Option 1 sounded like the right choice, except for the fact that Izuku really didn't want this issue following them into class, and the fact that of the warring emotions playing across Bakugu's aura, the most prominent, strangely enough, was regret. With these factors in mind, Izuku, against his better judgment, leaned back against the wall, mirroring Bakugu, and said, acidly, "So, Bakugu, are we going to talk like adults or are you going to attack me again?" Bakugu visibly flinched at that and bit out, "Don't call me that." Now Izuku was confused. Surely he didn't mean, "Call you what?" "Bakugu?" "Yes." Bakugu hissed, visibly frustrated. He ran his hand through his hair, clearly unable to find the words. "It's just, not right." "And what would you rather I call you instead?" Izuku asked, testing the waters. "Kaken." Kaken looked down, his aura screaming embarrassment. The silence lingered for a little while, before he uttered a small, "I'm sorry." Izuku arched a brow. Kaken, King Explosion Murder himself, apologizing? He was almost tempted to pinch himself and see if he was dreaming. For what? You know what? Kaken hissed, probably blushing furiously. He scrubbed a hand over his face. "I was a S-Tai kid. I was S-Tai to you. And I'm sorry, all right?" Smiling, Izuku replied, "It's okay, Kaken. I forgave you a long time ago." He didn't realize until he said it, but it was true. He had. Katsuki was confused. Very confused. He had apologized expecting anger and hate. After all, why else would Izuku ignore him for all this time? Izuku had just forgiven him. Just like that. What the HLO? If you forgave me a long time ago, then why did you ignore me all this time? It was spoken softly, quietly, so unlike Katsuki's usual way of speaking that even the boy himself was slightly taken aback. Izuku, instead of stuttering out explanations like Katsuki thought he would, and proving that he no longer knew this boy anymore, simply looked confused. Ignore you? Yes, you idiot. I've been sending you letters for years, trying to apologize, and you never wrote back, F Munch. Izuku ignored the name calling, instead electing to fiddle about with his hands and mutter, letters? Under his breath, until his eyes widened and he rounded on Katsuki with all the force of a hurricane. Where did you send the letters to, Kaken? Katsuki took a step back. I sent them to your caseworker. Why is that so important? They'd said that they'd pass it on. Izuku slumped back against the wall, looking deflated for some reason. Of course you did. D-Nit. And now Izuku was swearing. This day could officially not get any stranger. Except apparently it could, because then Izuku started pacing back and forth across the alley, muttering something about protection orders, and nothing Katsuki was doing got him to stop. Midoriya. And God, that sounded really weird. Izuku. Stop it for F's sake. That was when Katsuki's brain decided to throw in the towel because the next word out of his mouth was Zuku. Izuku froze. Katsuki froze. The alleyway was silent for all of 2 seconds before Izuku bounded up to him in the way that made him look like an excitable rabbit, and maybe Katsuki knew Izuku better than he thought, and said, You still remember that? And of course Katsuki did. How could he forget? They were going to be heroes for the ages. Zuku and Kaken, even better than All Might. Abruptly, Katsuki felt drained. He was just so done with this conversation. Everything was so emotionally charged, and Bakugo Katsuki just didn't do emotions. He pushed past Izuku and ran back to the dorms. Izuku watched Kaken leave, thoughts swirling through his head. He had some idea of what had gone wrong, but it was going to require some research. He had a new goal for this first year, now. Screw the sports festival. He was going to repair this friendship if it was the last thing he did. Izuku had just started to go to sleep when realized that he had done something stupid. In the emotional turmoil that was his conversation with Kaken, he had absolutely and completely forgotten to inform the other boy about his quirk. And tomorrow was the first day of school, which meant the quirk apprehension test, where he would have to use his quirk. Such an idiot. What a dumba. Why Izuku was allowed to be a member of society was a mystery to him. Maybe he was exaggerating a bit, but if Kaken saw him using his quirk tomorrow without any forewarning, that was a situation Izuku really, very much absolutely wanted to avoid. At all costs. He sighed, rolled over and tried to go to sleep. Maybe the problem would seem less daunting in the morning. Correction. The problem was not less daunting in the morning. Izuku had stayed up late worrying because, as established, he was an idiot, and so he both missed his chance to talk to Kaken and wound up having to miss a relaxed breakfast. Swearing at the time, Izuku grabbed a piece of toast and hightailed it towards the classroom, berating his idiotic idiotness. He made it to 1A with exactly 5 minutes to spare, pushed open the door to the classroom and immediately wished he hadn't. Kaken was sitting with his feet up on the desk, being berated by Ida. Why was this his life? Izuku suddenly felt a deep amount of sympathy for his dad and could almost hear him sigh and say, I don't get paid enough for this. Izuku was pulled out of his thoughts by Uraraka, who pulled him over to look at the seating plan and distracted him with talk of the newly debuted pro hero, MT Lady. This made him feel better for the minuscule amount of time it took for him to see he was seated behind Kaken, and while they may be on better terms, they still weren't anything close to friends. At that point his good spirits evaporated, saluted, said, Sayonara, suckers, and backflipped into the nether void. At least this day couldn't get any worse. If you want to play at making friends, go somewhere else. The sudden appearance of his dad, still encased in his favorite sleeping bag, at the door made a lot of the students scream and hurry to their seats. Izuku, well used to his antics, simply rolled his eyes and sat down. As Dad announced that there was going to be a quirk assessment test, Izuku leaned forward and tapped Kaken on the shoulder. Hey Kaken? Don't freak out but dash. Kaken grunted and shouldered his way out of the door before Izuku could finish his sentence. He sighed. Izuku really should know better than to tempt fate like that by now. Kyuka still wasn't entirely sure that they weren't dreaming. Everything about this situation seemed surreal. One moment they were an ordinary school kid and the next they were beating up robots, moving out of their house and taking quirk assessment tests. They hadn't really had very much time to process. On the plus side, no one else had either. Traipsing outside with the rest of their new classmates, Kyuka took a moment to steel themselves. They were not going to embarrass themselves. Aizawa-sensei? What about orientation? This came from a cute little brunette near the front of the group, and maybe she was actually a bit taller than Kyuka, so they really shouldn't call her little, but whatever, and was immediately backed up by murmurs of agreement from the rest of the class. Aizawa-sensei sighed and pinched his nose. Somehow Kyuka got the feeling that he didn't really want to be there. Part of the special thing about UA is its flexible curriculum. I can teach you guys however I like, and the orientation is not a worthwhile use of time. Midoriya. This was directed towards a short green-haired boy, who turned an interesting shade of red before stumbling up to the front. The blonde standing next to her, calamari or something, snorted and Kyuka elbowed him, hard, in the side. They could already tell that this idiot was going to cause a lot of problems for them. What was your softball throw record in middle school, Midoriya? Aizawa asked. Midoriya shifted on his feet and answered, 7.5 meters, sensei. Aizawa nodded. Okay. I want you to take this ball and throw it using your quirk. You can do whatever you like as long as you don't leave the circle. Midoriya nodded and took the softball from the teacher, stepping into the circle. Out of the corner of their eye, Kyuka saw a spiky-haired blonde stiffen with what looked like surprise? A mystery for another day, they supposed. Midoriya had situated himself in the circle and appeared to be messing with the ball. Kyuka wasn't quite sure what he was doing, but after a few seconds passed, he began to glow. Not lightly either. His entire body was lit up caustic green, and his hair was lifted and swaying in some invisible wind. The ball, held in his left hand, started glowing too, before floating in the air. With both hands free, Midoriya then placed what looked like a piece of foam, but Kyuka couldn't really tell from this distance, into his, now free, left hand. They took a brief second to wonder what he was doing before he flicked the foam with his right hand, and the ball shot into the distance. That wasn't even an exaggeration. The sound as the ball moved sounded like a rifle shot. The class stood in astonished bewilderment for the 10 seconds it took for Aizawa-sensei to show them the screen of his phone. 10:59.3 m. As the class erupted into noise around them, Kyuka's enhanced hearing was just good enough to pick out Aizawa-sensei's words as he whispered to Midoriya, "You're getting slow, problem child. Last week your score was 1179. Midoriya merely shrugged, a smile playing around his lips, unaware of Kyuka's gobsmacked stare. What the hell was his deal? And how did he know Aizawa-sensei? In Izuku's opinion, the assessment test wasn't too bad, if he ignored Katsuki's glare fixed on the back of his head. At least, he assumed he was glaring. Katsuki's orange angry explosions, which he noted had lost some of the loneliness from the first time he saw them, seemed to be focused towards him. What's this? It looks fun. And ignoring the fact that his classmates seemed to have a death wish. It looks fun, huh? His dad repeated, deadly quiet. You have 3 years to become a hero. Will you have that attitude the whole time? Izuku sighed. This wasn't going to end well. All right. His dad continued. Whoever comes last in all 8 tests will be judged to have no potential and will be punished with expulsion. Izuku sighed again. Knowing his dad's track record with expulsions, it wasn't out of the question. He was hoping that it was a logical ruse, though. He rather liked this class. Katsuki was said. Not only did Izuku suddenly have a quirk that he hadn't told him about, the F.R. kept beating him. In the ball throw. In the 50-meter dash. This wasn't how it was meant to go, God knit. He was meant to be the #1 hero. How was he meant to do that if he couldn't even ace a simple quirk assessment test? And what even was his quirk? Katsuki watched as Izuku flew across the long jump, balanced on what appeared to be a pile of sand, glowing the same caustic green as its rider. Katsuki waited. And seethed. And when his name came up at number 4 on the rankings, underneath Izuku, he pulled his childhood friend to the side, vaguely hearing Aizawa-sensei announcing that the whole thing was a logical ruse. "We need to talk." The only light in the room came from the screen. This didn't bother him. It was how it usually was. He watched a boy glow and a ball fly. He saw a small child and a dead girl. "Kurojiiri? Send my regards to Shigaraki. He has himself a deal." He often wonders why life is so arbitrary. A spark here becomes a fire there, growing, consuming until we can't consume anymore because we want to believe that we will leave our mark upon the world. And for a short time we do. The land is scorched and barren and black in the wake of our living. But each life is snuffed eventually, and the greenery returns, and our records are lost and forgotten, a blank slate ready to be burned anew. But by who, by what? For what purpose do we exist upon this barren, faceless earth? For surely the gods have forsaken us. Surely they have, for on what plane of existence does a god smile while their people die? This one, he supposes. He often wonders, because he has nothing to do but wonder and plan, here in this compound, where all walk freely with fear in their steps, a gilded, golden cage of death and lies, furnished with chains of loyalty. If he holds the key, does that mean he resides outside the cage? He doesn't think so. Once he would have said yes. Yes, because those on the throne do not lower themselves for those already on their knees, because the powerful do not bow for the weak. But now, he thinks about leaving, getting out. He could, surely, there are no chains binding him here, but thoughts of kind, young eyes and a cheerful smile pull him back. Is it wrong to be chained here by revenge? He doesn't think so. After all, if that murderer joins her in the grave, he can finally rest and dream of things that are not blood-stained walls and treacherous lies. Can't he? //. When Kaken told him that he wanted to talk, Izuku really should have expected something like this. This being pulled into a supply closest before he had a chance to eat lunch. Izuku sighed and pulled out an energy bar. And he was looking forward to lunch rush's food as well. "So," Kaken whisper yelled, "how come you're suddenly not quirkless anymore, S-tie nerd?" If Izuku had been in a better mood, the fact that Kaken was so angry all the time would have been amusing. As it was, his happiness waved from the bottom of the nether void. It had backflipped into that morning as if to remind him that it wasn't going to return anytime soon. It was probably playing poker with the devil down there. Littlest. Well. Kaken huffed, impatient. Izuku sighed again. If this conversation went badly, more than just his happiness was going to end up in the nether void. "Answer my question, god knit." "You see, Kaken, when a mommy and a daddy love each other very much?" "Not that question, Dumba." Izuku laughed. Kaken looked so frustrated. And he meant that literally. The way his energy was presenting simply screamed, frustration, frustration, frustration. I'm sorry. What? God, where do I even start?" Kaken kicked the wall, a pout clear in his voice. "Start anywhere, moron. I don't give a DMN." And so he did. Izuku talked for half an hour, until Kaken had migrated round the corner to sit next to him on the floor among all the cleaning supplies. He told him all about the villain attack, and Yamada-sensei and Aizawa-sensei adopting him. He didn't want to lie, not anymore. But he left out the part about the girl. He wasn't quite ready for Kaken to know that he was a killer yet. Would they look at him the same way when they knew? Ida? Uraraka? Kaken? His hands were stained with blood, and no matter how hard he tried, it wouldn't wash away. He talked about finding his quirk and training with his dads. Kaken was uncharacteristically quiet throughout the whole thing, and when Izuku ran out of words to say, the pair sat in slightly awkward silence for a minute, until Kaken abruptly stood up and faced the wall. "Why?" Izuku was taken aback. "Why what?" Even as the words left his mouth, he realized what this was about. Kaken whirled around, hands popping and what appeared to be furious tears in his eyes. "Why did you ignore my all this time, a hole?" Izuku had never seen him cry before. He placed a hand on Kaken's shoulder. "I didn't dash." "But you did," he roared, hands popping and tightly clenched into fists. Izuku pulled back. alarmed. Desperate times, desperate measures. Bakugu Katsuki. Kaken looked up, explosions silenced and surprise clear in his aura, as well as on his face, probably. Izuku privately smirked. That trick never failed when they were kids. Good to see it still worked. He walked forward until he was looking the blonde straight in, what he assumed were the eyes. I am not finished explaining, so sit your down and listen to me for once, instead of jumping to conclusions. The small 5-year-old inside of him was shaking in shock, running around and screaming, in disbelief that he had just yelled at Kaken, what the heck? The 15-year-old was doing pretty much the same thing, honestly. Kaken, looking slightly shell-shocked, if the way his explosive aura had slowed down was anything to go by, sank down until he was leaning against the wall again. Izuku joined him and started to explain. I suppose I should preface this with the fact that I never got a single one of your letters. Izuku held up a hand when Kaken's aura clouded over and it seemed like he was going to retort. Let me finish. There was a reason. He sighed and hugged his knees. Here went everything. Good. And it felt like he had just started to make progress in this friendship too. The blood was dripping off his hands, pooling on the ground. In the attack, there was a girl. A woman. I don't know. She slapped my mum dash. You've already told me this, Dumba. You were angry and your quirk manifested properly for the first time, right? You pushed the women away or some s. She died. Kaken's head whipped up to stare at him. Izuku was surprised. He didn't think he'd ever seen someone's aura look that flabbergasted. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he registered that he was starting to dissociate, which probably wasn't a very good sign. He would be more worried if the rest of his brain wasn't so focused on the drip of blood on the floor. Drip, drip. She hit Mum and I was angry. So very, very angry. I grabbed a piece of her top and used my quirk to throw her into the wall. And then she died. But the building collapsed surely dash. Izuku shook his head. I saw the autopsy report. Her neck was broken from blunt force trauma. None of the rubble could have caused it. It was definitely me. He could feel the nausea rising in his throat. Not now, damn it. He let Kaken process that in silence for a moment, before he continued the story. He had to get this out before he choked. Anyway, this girl was the daughter of a well-known crime lord. I kept getting death threats, so my parents eventually blocked all of our mail. I guess they never rescinded the order. So that's why, Kaken. I never tried to ignore you. I wouldn't. Izuku tipped his head back against the wall. Kaken didn't say anything. Of course he didn't. Who would want to talk to a murderer? Red flowers blooming on the floor. Burning timbers, blood and gore. Drip, drip. Kaken was still silent. How long had they been sitting here? How long had Kaken been rolling in silent disgust? Izuku didn't know. He didn't know. Dimly, he registered that at some point he had started crying. His vision swam, and he could see the blood pooling on the floor. Red flowers blooming on the floor. Burning timbers, blood and gore. Drip, drip. Your crimes are written on the walls. Murder. By a cheater. Only villain still lives. Will they stay when they know you're the thing they despise? Somewhere, in a part of his mind that wasn't consumed by the panic attack, he was screaming at himself to calm the F down. On no planet did he want Kaken to see him like this. His chest grew tighter, and the tears fell through his hands which he'd brought up at some point to cradle his face, and even as the water passed his hands they wouldn't come clean, and his heart kept beating faster, each bit a repetition of grief, hurt, guilt, rage, pain. Breathe. Come on, Izuku, breathe with me. In for 4, out for in for 4, out for 4. Izuku followed his mystery savior's directions, just being. Just breathing. 1-2-3-4. For -3-2-1. Breathe. When he eventually came back to himself, an unknowable amount of time later, he realized that he was curled into someone's side, and they were stroking his hair, humming softly under their breath. The person's voice was rough and low, and they smelled of burnt sugar and smoke. Kaken. Abruptly, Izuku sat up, ignoring the pain in his skull and yelped from his impromptu human pillow. Standing on shaky legs, he stumbled to the door and was about to twist the doorknob when he was stopped by a warm hand on his wrist. "Where are you going, is Thai nerd?" Kaken asked, lopsided grin clear in his aura and in his voice. Izuku started. "I'm leaving." "The hell are you doing that for?" "You need to go to the nurse or something, Dumba. A panic attack that bad, you need to tell someone." Staring, Izuku asked, "Why do you know so much about this stuff? You were really good at helping me calm down earlier." Kaken scuffed his feet along the floor. "I used to get him. When I was little." Realizing that he wasn't going to say any more than that, Izuku reached for the door once more, frowning in confusion as Kaken moved to leave with him. "Why are you still here talking to me?" Kaken's aura soured, he was scowling. "Why wouldn't I be? Why would you want to talk to me now that dash?" Realization dawned on the blonde. "You think I won't want to talk to you now that I know what happened to the girl?" "Call it what is, Kaken." The other boy gazed off to the side, aura rupturing slowly in arcs of brilliant orange and voice deceptively soft. "Murder. Ye-dash. Bulls." Izuku took a step back as Kaken's palms began to pop. "That's bulls, Izuku. You are not to blame for what happened, as much as you keep trying to pretend it is. There's no way a fang lame quirk like yours could do any damage anyway, especially if your Dumba is using it." The room was silent for a spell, before Izuku burst out laughing. It was just such a Kaken way of reassuring someone. "Wah, are you laughing at me, Thai nerd?" They sat back down on the dusty floor, talking about everything and nothing all at once. It felt like warmth, like friendship. Izuku had missed this. When nothing else was left to say, Izuku got up to leave. As he pulled the door open, he was stopped by a quiet, "Zuku?" "What? Can I call you Zuku again? 'Cause I can't very well keep calling you Deku, now can I?" Kaken's aura was the most open and vulnerable he had ever seen it, and Izuku wanted to scream success to the heavens. While it might have taken yelling and a panic attack, this was a huge leap towards being friends again. "Sure you can, Kaken." By the time Izuku and Kaken had made it out of the supply cupboard, the cafeteria had stopped serving lunch. Sighing, the two trekked back to class for the remaining half an hour, their stomachs growling. Inside, the room was just as rowdy as it had been that morning. The loudest group, whose base colors, Izuku noticed, were all complementary, red, pink, and yellow, were making a game out of throwing paper ball at the back of Ida's head. Suddenly, Izuku saw the familiar running blue code of one of Nezu's helper robots waiting at the door. Turning towards it, he pressed the button at the side that read out the recipient. "Little gremlin," the robot chirped, cheerfully. Izuku facepalmed. It was almost like Uncle Nezu wanted to out him. Actually, knowing his Uncle Nezu, he probably did. Hopefully no one but Kaken was close enough to hear. Izuku opened the top compartment and removed 2 bentos as well as a handwritten note. He silently handed Kaken one and motioned towards the desks. Kaken, thankfully, understood, but on the way past he whispered to Izuku, "Little gremlin?" "Don't ask." Kaken chuckled softly and made his way to his seat. Izuku was about to open the note, but his hopes of no one noticing the robot were dashed when the loud pink smooth hypergirl made her way over from the corner. "Hey, cool robot. Is it yours? What's your name?" "I'm Mina Ishido." Under the onslaught of questions and the fact that this girl was way too far into his personal space, Izuku could do nothing but stammer. Dash. Thankfully, he was saved by a friendly red insecure boy, which was a very interesting combination, especially considering that, judging by his aura, his quirk was some sort of hardening/defense, who introduced himself as Kirishima. "You're too excitable sometimes, Mina-chan, geez. Give the boy some space." Izuku shook his head. "No, it's fine. The robot's not mine, it's Principal Nezu's, and my name is Midoriya Izuku." "Hey, cool!" Mina exclaimed. The two started examining the robot, and Izuku turned his attention back to the note. It was written in smooth, looping cursive, and it would forever be a mystery to Izuku as to how Nezu could write like that with paws for hands. "Little gremlin, while I am very glad that you and Bakugo are bonding, please don't forget to eat lunch. Your parents will come after me and I don't want to have to deal with that, Please and thank you. Izuku snorted. Trust his uncle Nedzu to admit he was stalking him, bash his parents and act like one himself in the span of a sentence. That aside, would you please pass a message on to Uraraka Ochiko? Her aura, unless I'm mistaken, should be to do with floating/gravity and pink. Your favorite uncle, tongue sticking out. P.S. No, I'm not telling you what the message is. Your clue is as follows. 70%. Every day is opportunity to learn. Plus ultra. Izuku sighed. Well, if his uncle didn't know that he and Uraraka had already met, then at least there were no cameras in the dorms. That was a relief. Hey Uraraka-san. Come here a moment. Uraraka shouted her consent and started making her way towards him. And that was when Mina snatched the letter out of his hand. But he'd have to thank Nedzu for outing him later. Inside his office, Nedzu shivered. He switched his CCTV to Class 1A, saw what was happening, and started writing his will. Hey! Mina shouted, loud enough to gather the attention of the entire class. Is this letter to you, Midoriya-san? Izuku stepped back, waving his arms in front of his face. God, why couldn't he lie when he was flustered? No. Yes, well not exactly. Mina's eyes flashed in recognition as she continued reading. Midoriya-kun. Izuku did a double take. He was sent just a minute ago. I have an idea. Izuku immediately recognized the look on Mina's face as the one he wore when he was in gremlin child mode. Shoot. He did not like where this was going. Hey, Kaminari-kun. Mina shouted. Set up the projector. The final member of their trio, a goofy yellow happy boy, nodded his assent and moved to do just that. Meanwhile, Mina shoved Izuku to the front of the classroom, despite Kirishima's whispered complaints. This meant that, 5 minutes later, Izuku was standing at the front of the class with Nedzu's letter projected onto the board behind him and 19 people staring at him expectantly. He wanted to die, and someone was going to pay for this. Meanwhile, back in his office, Nedzu rechecked the feeds, winced and started prepping the underground bunker. Just in case. Izuku watched in mute horror as each of his classmates read the letter and thwacked his head down on the desk. Even with his head face down, he could see the exact moment each person realized what was going on, as each of their auras flared in surprise. Apart from Kaken, who simply sat there looking smug. And that wasn't even an exaggeration, his explosions were incredibly self-satisfied. Izuku groaned again. Was it too early for his dad to arrive? Preferably right this very second? Excuse me, Midoriya, was it? What does this letter mean? The voice belonged to a uptight red bouncy girl in the third row. As she spoke, Ida nodded along and Izuku tried his best to level a death glare in his direction. He already knew what this was about, didn't? Izuku had told him, that first day. But no use complaining now. Izuku was just going to have to explain as best he could. Without mentioning any actual information about himself, because if he did he would A. be putting himself in danger, and B. would lose his bet with his pops, so. This was going to go great. Izuku sighed and said, why do you all care so much? It's just a letter from Nedzu. It was only when Mina let out a shocked, Nedzu's your uncle? And the class erupted into noise that Izuku remembered how Nedzu had signed that letter. He flushed a bright crimson and began to stammer out excuses. It was official. Someone was definitely going to die today. Nedzu sneezed and decided that it would probably be in his best interests to double his preparations on that bunker. He felt like he was going to need it. Eventually, the class, and Izuku, were recovered enough that the Greenette could make a coherent story. Well, I discovered my quirk quite late and my parents have connections with UA, so I kinda spent a bit of time here as a kid. So, yeah, that's why he signed the letter like that. Izuku said, rubbing the back of his neck self-consciously. He was about to step off the podium, and seriously, what was he up there for, when Mina, who he was really starting to dislike, spoke up and said, what does he mean by Uraraka's aura? Well, Izuku said, cursing everything in the universe and all the cosmic forces that hated him apparently, it's, part of my quirk? Oh right. Uraraka jumped in. He was going to have to remember to buy her some chocolates later. You told me about it in the dorms, right? The class started muttering again, and thankfully gave Izuku time to gather his thoughts. So? Mina asked, bouncing in her seat like an excitable puppy. Izuku sighed again. Basically, I was born blind. He ignored the whispers. He'd dealt with much worse. To make up for that, when I developed my quirk, I basically gained a sense that shows me a 360 degrees view of the area around me. It's like a sphere of awareness? Yeah, let's go with that. People have different auras, so that what Nedza meant. Uraraka is warm, pink and bubbly, but also kinda floaty? People's auras can tell me a bit about their emotional state and their quirk. They also have a base color and then two traits that are expressed in a way that mimics their quirk. At the end of his explanation, the classroom exploded. Everyone was yelling at the same time until Kaken finally set off explosions from his palms and told everyone to shut up, US Thai effing extras. When everyone was finally quiet again, Izuku rested his head against the desk. Can I go sit down now? He took the silence to mean yes, until Uraraka timidly raised her hand. He might have to rescind those chocolates. What was the message Nedzu wanted you to give me? It was a valid question, so Izuku glanced back and forth between the gravity girl and the board a few times before saying, it's a bit private, so you might not want me to say it here. Uraraka shook her head and said that it was fine for everyone to know. Nedzu wanted me to pass on that 70% of your tuition fee is being paid for by UA. Uraraka beamed and reached for her phone to tell her parents the good news. Sensing there would be no more questions from Mina, and thank God for that, Izuku went to step down from the podium, only to be halted by a voice from the back row. How'd you work that one out, Izuku? Izuku simply sighed and said, nice to see you again too, Hitoshi. We really have to stop meeting like this. Hitoshi didn't quite understand the concept of friends until middle school. There were people who tolerated his existence, but he was shunned, forgotten. Then he met a green-haired wonder child in a park, and everything changed. 5 years later, he was in his dream school, and $500,000 richer, thanks to the lawsuit Izuku had filed against his middle school. He had seen the greenette around, but it wasn't until Mina pushed him up to the front of the class and proceeded to embarrass him 10 ways to Sunday that he finally decided to speak up. It wasn't like they didn't see each other out of school all the time, anyway. How'd you work that one out, Izuku? Izuku, well used to his antics by now, sighed and replied, nice to see you again too, Hitoshi. We really have to stop meeting like this. The rest of Hitoshi's classmates were frowning confusedly, but Hitoshi grinned wolfishly and said, that's true, I suppose. How many people did we make cry that day? He was, of course, referring to the April's Fool Day prank. It had truly been their greatest masterpiece, and he and Izuku had once blown up a zero-pointer with nothing but a glue stick and a pen cap. I believe was the whole school, problem children. The voice of his mentor came from the doorway, and the two co-conspirators shared equally terrifying grins. At the look on their faces, Aizawa-sensei sighed and put his head in his hands. And no, problem children. There will be no pranks in this classroom. I'm pretty sure an entire generation of heroes still has PTSD over the one 5 years ago. With that, Aizawa-sensei began the lesson, and the class was left to ponder the mystery that was the two problem children. Yaoyorozu Momo didn't quite understand Midoriya. She had been pondering the mystery since lunchtime, but the only thing she had managed to conclude was that she couldn't conclude anything. Every answer seemed to only create more questions. Why had his quirk come in late? Why come to UA to control it? What was the deal with his quirk, actually, because it seemed to be both a mental and physical type at the same time, and Momo had never heard of anything like that, ever. She was startled out of her thoughts by a tug on her sleeve. Yamamo? Are you coming? We have to change for foundational heroics. The voice belonged to Jiro, a nice person Momo had met in the dorms yesterday. They were really laid back, and their hair was so soft and fluffy and... bad Momo. Bad. This was not the time to be a useless gay DMN. It definitely didn't help that Jiro's hair looked really, really soft and all Momo wanted to do was run her hands through it. Nope. Not at all. Goodness. This really was developing into a crush way to God and fast for her liking. As Momo had been lost in thought, the pair arrived at the changing rooms. She was about to walk in when she felt Jairu hesitating behind her. Their eyes flashed between the boys and the girls' changing rooms nervously, and Momo felt a pang of sympathy. "Hey, Jairu?" Momo said, stuttering over her words a bit, and it was definitely not because Jairu was really hot, okay? "Stop judging her. If you want, there's a gender-neutral bathroom just around the corner." Jur beamed, and God if that didn't do things to her poor gay heart. "Thanks, Momo. You're a lifesaver," they said, and then reached up on their tiptoes to press a soft kiss to Momo's cheek before skipping off in the direction of the bathroom. Momo buried her face in her hands and silently screamed. Good. She was so screwed. Turning into the girls' changing rooms, Momo pulled out her costume and proceeded to change. When she finally had it on, she realized that it was a bit more revealing than she expected. It was fine though. It was what her quirk needed to work, right? Momo was one of the last ones changed, so she started making her way to ground beta alone, humming a song quietly under her breath. If that song happened to be Girls Like Girls by Hayley Kiyoko, well, that was no one's business but her own. // It was when she opened the door leading to ground beta that she encountered two boys from general studies. Or at least she assumed that was where they were from, based on the classroom they were leaving. The shorter of the pair leered at her, saying, "Man, who knew the hero course girls were so desperate for some they have to resort to dressing like common slots?" Momo stumbled back as if she had been hit, which she honestly felt like she had been. The other snorted and made to leave but was stopped in his tracks by the 154 centimeters of furiousness that was Jairu Kyuka. "What do you two holes think you're doing?" they asked, anger seeping into their voice and turning in acidic. "Oh, and look, here's Miss Slot's friend." "What's wrong? Not gonna spread your legs like a good little girl?" the shorter asked. Jairu smiled, but it was more of a smirk, Momo thought, a dangerous slash of a sword, promising pain. No, she didn't find it hot. "Shut up. Not a girl," they said, "but I do have a gift for you." "Oh, what's this, Ike?" Jairu launched their attack, and with the help of their quirk, managed to successfully defenestrate the two creeps. "Well," Jairu said, "that takes care of that." They then walked over to where Momo had crumpled against the wall. "Yamamo? Are you okay?" Momo sobbed and buried her face in their shoulder. Is that what I look like?" Soldash. Jairu was quick to soothe her. No, it's okay." She breathed. "You look amazing, Yamamo. Why don't we go talk to Aizawa-sensei?" Momo sniffed and nodded, dragging herself up from the floor, and pulled Jairu into a hug. In the quiet of the dorms, late at night, two figures lay staring at the stars. Jairu. Thanks." Katsuki wasn't quite sure what to make of the newly revealed friendship between Izuku and the purple-haired F.R. who looked like he hadn't slept. Whatever. The pair were walking ahead of him on the path to ground beta, and while he couldn't quite make out what they were saying, he could clearly see that purple F.O. was making Izuku laugh, his green curls bouncing as he threw his head back in amusement. The sight made something weird curl in his stomach, a feeling that Katsuki couldn't even begin to identify. It was why when the redhead from the Dumba trio, as he had christened them in his head, came bouncing over and draped himself over his arm, he didn't explode kill them into the stratosphere. He did, however, squawk and flail around enough that the tie-haired menace was evicted from his personal space. "The F are you doing, guys, tie-hair?" This tie-hair simply beamed and said, "I didn't think you could fit that many swear words in one sentence. That's really manly. I'm Kirishima, by the way." While Katsuki stared at him, mouth agape, Kirishima turned around to summon the rest of his Dumba squad over to meet this super manly guy. "What did you say your name was?" "Bakugu." The rest of the walk was spent with Katsuki trying to get away from the brain cell killing idiocy that was the combination of Mina, Kaminari, and Kirishima, and the idiots blatantly ignoring said efforts. As Katsuki ducked underneath another of Mina's attempts to hug him, "Come on, blasty boy. You must be capable of affection." He reflected that with these Dumbas laughing around him, he could almost ignore the pang in his chest he got whenever he looked at Izuku. Almost. Izuku hadn't quite been prepared for Kaken's hero costume. His own he was pretty happy with. It consisted of a green jumpsuit and hood that looked simple but was actually able to suppress the light of his quirk if he so wished. There was a SW's on the side of his neck. It was something he had been working on with Majima-sensei for a while now. While the intimidation factor, the glowing aspect of his quirk created was great sometimes, it was not good for stealth. The suppressor worked a bit like a bubble, except skin-tight. It basically made sure that nothing but his eyes glowed while his quirk was in use. It also had sheaths for his weapons, which were a boa staff and a pair of knives. They had been the first weapons he'd picked up in training, and he'd never really put them down. He'd had the design for years and was pretty pleased with the result. That wasn't surprising. What was surprising was Kaken's hero costume. The problem wasn't that it looked really hot on him, although it probably was. Izuku couldn't tell if it did or not with his sight. The problem was that it was almost the exact design that Izuku had talked about with Kaken at the age of 4, when his quirk first came in, under the blanket during a sleepover, right down to the grenade gauntlets on his hands. Kaken's aura suddenly spiked with the smug pride, and Izuku realized he must have been caught staring. He blushed and looked away. "Gay," Hitoshi whispered right in his ear. Izuku squawked and turned around, flailing his arms and whacking the purple-haired menace as hard as he could. "Hitoshi! You can't just keep doing that to me." Hitoshi shrugged, leaning back against the gate leading to Ground Beta. His dad had told them to get changed and meet them here, but he had yet to arrive. Either Aizawa was waiting until they relaxed to land a brutal surprise attack on them under the guise of teaching, or he was still asleep. It was probably the latter, but Izuku didn't plan on letting his guard down. Just in case. "What's the deal with you and Blasty Boy over there, anyway?" Hitoshi asked, tipping his head back to, presumably, look at the sky. Izuku tilted his head. "Blasty Boy? Yeah. You weren't there, 'cause you overslept, probably, but this morning the robot boy with glasses started going off about Bakugo have his feet on the desk, and Bakugo's hands kept exploding. So, Blasty Boy." Izuku face-bombed. Trust Kaken to get into an argument about school desks, of all things. Hitoshi's aura suddenly sharpened with interest, and only then did Izuku realize what he had done. "Kaken, huh?" Izuku waved his arms through the air, stuttering, and with a face as red as a tomato, probably. Not that tomatoes looked red to Izuku. They looked green, like most plants, but apparently they looked red to everyone else. "No, nothing like that, Hitoshi. We're just childhood friends, is all. We lost contact after the attack. I moved away." Hitoshi hummed, and went back to staring at the sky. After a long, but not uncomfortable, pause, Izuku broke the silence with, "Reckon Eda'd be mad if we told him about everything we've done to the desks?" Hitoshi snorted, then started full-on laughing, Izuku chuckling along with him. Over their 5 years of friendship, the pair had pulled a lot of pranks. Most of them involved the UA desks, and everything had been done to them, from writing all over them to turning them into robots, courtesy of the UA support department. The silence fell once again, and Izuku couldn't help but think about how they first met. A purple boy crouched in a park, frantically trying to rip a muzzle off his face, shoved there with taunts of villain and freak. He sobbed and cried, and still couldn't rip it off. Glowing green eyes emerged from the darkness. "Are you okay?" Gentle hands lifted away the muzzle, and he sat down next to the purple boy, letting him sob into his shirt until the sun rose above the trees. "Hey, Izuku? What is it, Hitoshi?" Hitoshi's aura popped with smugness. "You like Blasty Boy, don't you?" "Hitoshi!" Izuku knew his day was going to go badly the moment the words, "class president," left his dad's mouth. All the other students started yelling about it being a normal student activity. Izuku snorted. They would soon learn that there was no such thing as a normal at UA. Hitoshi, sat behind him, looked similarly amused. Kaken caught their smiles out of the corner of his eye and his aura flared warningly. They could practically hear the "What are you two dumbis planning?" echo through the air. Izuku and Hitoshi just smiled back at him innocently. The blonde snorted and turned around, clearly unconvinced but grudging, realizing that there was nothing he could do to stop whatever was happening. Not that Izuku and Hitoshi were planning anything, of course. but it was always good to keep people on their toes. A lot of yelling, a couple of rigged votes, voting twice is cheating, Kaminari, and quite a few groans later, Ida was elected class president with Yaoyorozu as vice president. Izuku sunk back in his seat with a sigh of relief. He had narrowly avoided a candidate role by exactly 1 vote. God knows he wouldn't be able to deal with paperwork on top of UA homework and extracurricular training. One last thing, before you all go to your next lessons, Aizawa-sensei announced. We're going on a field trip tomorrow, so make sure you bring or give me anything you might need for that, such as extra food and water, or any things you might need for your quirk. The room erupted in frantic whispers, and his dad quickly exited the room so he wouldn't have to deal with any overexcited teenagers, or, God forbid, questions. For all that he spent most of his time in a sleeping bag, Dad was flipping fast when he wanted to be. Hitoshi wandered over to join Izuku and Kaken as they left the classroom. So? Field trip? Where are we going, Izuku? Izuku just raised an eyebrow. Bold of you to assume that Aizawa-sensei told me where we're going. Kaken looked confused. But you're his dash. Before he could finish the sentence, Izuku had slammed his hand over his mouth. Essex, he whispered frantically. You're going to make me lose my bet with Pops. Bet? Hitoshi questioned. Izuku sighed and led the way down the corridor, studiously ignoring the spluttering and bitten-off curse words coming from the direction of Kaken. Yep. He bet me that Dad wouldn't be able to hide our relationship for 3 full days, because apparently we are totally obvious about it. I said we could, and the outcome will determine whether or not Pops gets to buy a parakeet, so it is vitally important I do not lose. The sanity of UA depends on it. As Kaken and Hitoshi pondered the horror that would be present Mike plus a parakeet, Izuku pulled open the door to Midnight's classroom and ushered them inside. By lunchtime, Katsuki had decided that purple-haired Pineapple, despite his perpetual tiredness, wasn't all that bad. His jokes was effing hilarious, and most of the lunch break was spent coming up with increasing ridiculous insults while Izuku sat in between them with his head in his hands, bemoaning his choice in friends. Of course you two are bonding over insulting people. Of course. What even is this sorry existence of mine? I must have been a tax collector in a previous life, for the world to hate me this much. Shinso elbowed him in the side. Hey, Bakugo, looks like Izuku isn't feline too good. Katsuki smirked. They were doing puns now? Bring it. Bakugo. Katsuki had never backed down from a challenge in his life, and he didn't intend to start now. Nah, I think our jokes are too punny to make anyone sad. But hey, I have lots of great fruit jokes to make, and if he doesn't appreciate those I think we'll have to let that man go. Izuku groaned and sunk onto the floor as Shinso cracked up and nearly keeled over laughing. Just as Katsuki was about to deliver another terrible fantastic joke, an alarm started blaring. Izuku sat up from the floor immediately, frowning in concern. That alarm means someone's breached the campus. Breached the campus? Shinso whisper-screamed. But that means... Izuku nodded grimly. I don't know who got in, but whatever Izuku was about to say was cut off by the sound of Ida slamming into the wall above the door and announcing that it was just the media and not villains. As everyone else started cheering for emergency exit Ida. Katsuki noticed that Izuku was still staring morosely out of the window. He nudged him. Leonard, what's the problem now? Izuku frowned. Something doesn't feel right. Shinso poked Izuku's other shoulder. Hey, Mr. Downer, if you don't hurry up we're going to be late for foundational hero studies. Izuku sighed and stood up. I guess you're right. Let's go then. Hey Izuku, want to hear another joke? No, I don't. Hitoshi. Kaken? Why are you laughing? Kaken? Outside, the dusty remains of the UA barrier drifted away on the wind. Shiro Hanta wouldn't class himself as an excitable person. Usually. But today was their class first UA field trip, so he thought he can be excused. And he wasn't the only excited one. The dumbass trio, composed of Ishido, Kirishima and Kaminari, had been doing the conga around the room for the past 5 minutes, singing, "Field trip, we're going on a field trip, Field trip, we're going in a trip," and dragging more and more reluctant people in. The group was eventually cut off by the arrival of Bakugo and Midoriya, by which Hanta meant that the latter sank down in his seat and started talking to Shinso while blatantly ignored his friend's attempts to kill his classmates into oblivion. After the conga line was successfully destroyed by Bakugo, the blonde wandered over to Shinso and Midoriya and launched into calm conversation, like he hadn't just tried to blow up the classroom. And the other two just rolled with it. Hanta shook his head. He was never going to understand those three, not even if he lived to be each by themselves was bad enough, but put them together and the amount of cryptid energy was probably enough to put even Bigfoot to shame. A flash of yellow caught his eye, and Zero turned around to see Kaminari approaching his desk in the same way he did everything, with far too much energy for someone who didn't drink coffee. Seriously, if Zero drank enough coffee that he became as energetic as Kaminari, he'd probably die. "Hey there, Zero!" Kaminari exclaimed, bouncing on the edge of his toes. "Ready for this field trip? No one's going to be ready for anything if you lot don't quiet down." Aizawa-sensei sagged in his seat at the front of the classroom, for once not clad in his yellow caterpillar sleeping bag. "Right," he said, standing up. "Let's go, you lot. We're off to the USJ." Katsuki liked to think that he had gotten over most of his anger issues. As anyone who knew him would tell you, he had not, in fact, gotten over most of his anger issues. But when the entire bus took it upon themselves to call him out on his trashy personality, he thought he was justified trying to blow the lot of them up. Verbally, of course. He wasn't that big of an idiot that he would try to blow up a bus while being, inside the bus. That didn't stop him, however, from describing to his classmates in extremely graphic detail where they could stick their stupid petty bulls insults dash. "Hey, come on, Kaken." Izuku whined. "Can't you commit bodily harm quieter? This bus is so loud I can't think." Wordlessly, Katsuki got off his chair and sat down, huffing in displeasure. The peace was quickly disturbed again, however, by someone coughing, "whipped," into the silence a bit louder than they should have done. Katsuki's shriek of outrage could probably have been heard in China. The class narrowly escaped death by explosion due to the bus's arrival at the USJ, where the rescue hero, 13, greeted them with what Katsuki assumed was a smile, but really could have been anything with the hero's expressionless helmet. "Welcome to the Unforeseen Simulation Joint, or USJ," they said, beckoning them up the steps. Faintly, in the background, Katsuki could hear Kaminari say, "Oh, so that's what it stands for. I thought it was Universal Studios Japan." 13 opened the big double doors and ushered them inside. "Here, in this specialist training facility, you're going to take part in a rescue exercise. However, before I explain that, I need to tell you something." They picked up a rock and threw it in the air, where it hovered for a moment before being sucked in by their quirk and disappearing into their gloves. "My quirk is black hole. It can suck anything in, including light. Anything I absorb turns to dust. I work as a rescue hero, but can you imagine what would happen if I used my quirk on a person?" From the looks on Katsuki's classmates' faces, they had not. "Your powers are not meant to inflict harm. I hope that you leave here today with the understanding that you're meant to help people." 13 looked around the space. Apparently satisfied with what they saw, they turned to Aizawa-sensei. "I do believe we're ready to start the lesson." Suddenly, Jair stepped forward and said, Aizawa-sensei? What's that?" They pointed a shaking finger to the plaza, where a darkness was gathering, reaching outwards and growing until it gaped, a large rip in the fabric of the world. "A warp quirk," Katsuki thought queasily. "That's a FING warp quirk." A face loomed out of the portal, twisted up in the most horrifying smile Katsuki had ever seen. "Hello, children. We're the League of Villains, and we've come to crash the party." Suddenly, Jair stepped forward and said, Aizawa-sensei? What's that?" They pointed a shaking finger to the plaza, where a darkness was gathering, reaching outwards and growing until it gaped, a large rip in the fabric of the world. "A warp quirk," Katsuki thought queasily. "That's a FING warp quirk." A face loomed out of the portal, twisted up in the most horrifying smile Katsuki had ever seen. "Hello, children. We're the League of Villains, and we've come to crash the party." Izuku was not having a good day. As villains started flooding through the portal, he reflected that whoever decided that becoming a hero was a viable career choice was an idiot. Oh wait, that was him. His dad readied his capture weapon even as someone in the crowd behind him shakily asked, "Is this part of the exercise?" Aizawa-sensei opted to avoid the question in favor of telling 13 to protect the students before jumping into the crowd of villains swarming below. Izuku went to follow. His dad couldn't fight this many villains by himself, he was good but not that good, only to be held back by 13. He shot a glare at them but they simply sighed and said, "I know, Midoriya. Believe me, I know. But the students need to get to safety." Izuku grimaced but nodded. "We'll bring help." 13 inclined their head in a way that Izuku had come to learn meant they were smiling. Izuku turned to the students who were standing around in shock, gazing at the crowd of villains in trepidation. "Come on guys. Everybody out." Kirishima frowned. "But, Aizawa-sensei?" Izuku shook his head. "He can fight better if he's not worrying about us. Come on, hurry." The class suddenly sparked into action and made for the door, only to be stopped by the warping villain from earlier. "Whoops, sorry children. I can't have you running to get help now, can I?" He swept his arms out and conjured up numerous portals into which he started dumping Izuku's classmates. Kaken made a valiant attempt at escape but was eventually caught when he accidentally bumped into Kirishima. Izuku, for his part, managed to dodge several portals before being outmaneuvered when one opened unexpectedly behind him. From the splash he'd heard from the flood zone, he'd expected to be teleported to a different area of the USJ, but he was dumped unceremoniously out of the warp gate in the middle of the plaza, right in front of the fountain, at the feet of the presumed leader of the League of Villains with the words, "Midoriya Izuku, young Mr. Shigaraki." Up close, his aura was terrifying. It was blood and death and decay, all cracked and shattered and falling to the ground in monochrome tones of gray. From this information Izuku could deduce two things. The villain, Shigaraki, had a quirk that could decay things, probably by touch if the numerous hands on his costume were anything to go by, and he wouldn't hesitate to kill Izuku in the most painful way possible. Seriously. Izuku had seen axe-wielding serial killers with better psyches than that. As for where he had seen axe-wielding serial killers, well, let's just say that Nedzu had a very interesting take on family outings. Green hair, green eyes, you match the description. You are Midoriya Izuku, aren't you? At Izuku's silence, he chuckled. Great. We got someone who's been dying to see you. Shoyuta didn't actually think things could get any worse. He was outnumbered about 1 to 100, 13 was caught up at the entrance fighting the portal guy. He was then reminded why he didn't taunt the universe like that as he watched, helpless, as 13 was taken down by the portal villain and Izuku was transported right across the plaza to sprawl at the feet of the leader of this attack, who, if the portal villain was to be believed, was called Shigaraki. He was wrong. This was so much worse. Shoyuta spun around and threw his elbow into the face of another low-level thug. They were all CRP at fighting, but there were a lot of them and the strain was beginning to wear at his eyes. Sighing, he readied his capture weapon. There was nothing for it. He was just going to have to fight his way to his son. "I'm coming, Izuku. Hold on. Just hold on." He straightened his tie, in a drab office that hadn't been his for the past 3 years. His adopted son had stepped up to run what had once been his family, and he was now nothing more than an elaborate figurehead. But that was fine. He had more important things to worry about. The powerful did not bow to the weak. He held the key and he would show them what it meant to be king. His legs ached beneath him and his bones creaked. His body was too old, now, for this violence, but his soul was screaming for anger and blood and death. He would not stop now. Not so close to his goal. The song of the stars and the earth is death and death, spun out between galaxies in a whispered song not song that twirls everything in the universe along its stave. He would take these mortal hands and play it, be the musician at the end of the world. He will ensure death for those who took his life from him, play their way into mass graves and graceless heaps only the rats would visit. This was his promise. His oath. Kawarita Kazoku straightened his tie and stepped through a portal into the U.S. Izuku was going to ask what Shigaraki meant about someone dying to see him, but stopped when another portal opened up in front of him. Through it stepped a middle-aged man in a suit and carrying a briefcase. Izuku would have said that he looked like a regular businessman if it wasn't for the gun clutched tightly in his left hand. "Why, hello there, Ayin," the man said, crouching down to meet his eyes and tilting his chin upwards with the pistol. Izuku could feel the cold barrel of the gun casually resting against his chin, and his mouth went dry. He wanted to pull away, but he couldn't, he was pinned in place. A quick look at the man's aura confirmed that, yep, this guy's quirk was probably paralytic eye contact. A pair of glowing, red eyes shone at him through a miasma of hate and fractured glass. A second look confirmed that this new villain was almost as bloodthirsty as Shigaraki. Widening his awareness, he could see that his dad was preoccupied fighting off a swarm of thugs and 13 was down near the entrance. Which meant he was going to be fighting off two bloodthirsty villains all by himself, and one of them had a gun. This was going to go great. Don't ignore me, Izuku-an. The creepy way the villain crooned his name made him shiver. "I'm Kawarita Kazoku. We have some unfinished business, you and I." Izuku felt the paralysis lessen for a moment before coming back full force, confirming his theory that the effect was cancelled if Kawarita closed his eyes or looked away. Unfinished business? Izuku questioned. He was going to have to play this carefully if he didn't want to get shot. "Does the name Sensei mean anything to you?" At Izuku's silence, Kawarita's aura flared angrily. "How rude. You kill my daughter and don't even bother to learn her name." Jirokyuka would like to say they weren't exactly sure when, exactly, everything had gone to S. When their class was made the target of a villain attack, the motives of which were still frighteningly unclear. When they had enrolled for UA. No, Kyuka knew exactly when everything had gone to S. It was the second they met Yaoyorozu Momo and their useless gay heart had decided to go and develop a giant, life-ruining, heart-stopping crush on a girl they had just met. Yes, they decided as they narrowly dodged a projectile taking their head off, they were going to die because they were too busy staring at the fact that Yamamo looked way too hot holding a sword. Holy fool! "Kaminari!" Yamamo yelled, suddenly, which reminded Kyuka that that dumbass was here as well. No, they hadn't forgotten because they were being really fang gay. "Shut up. Can you electrocute these guys? Just enough that they pass out." "I can try." Kaminari yelled back. "But what about you, Dash? We'll be fine. Just do it." Momo's arm reached out, suddenly, and pulled Kyuka towards her before shielding them both under an insulation blanket. As the smell of ozone grew ever more present, a clear sign that Kaminari was about to use his quirk, Kyuka buried their head in Yamamo's collarbone and tried not to think about how gay they were, because these were not appropriate thoughts to have in the middle of a fight god knit. Staring in wonder at the back of their head, Momo did the same. "I killed his daughter?" Izuku thought, uncomprehending for a brief second before understanding dawned. The villain attack when he was 7. The girl he killed. This girl was the daughter of a well-known crime lord. "I kept getting death threats." And he gazed at Kawarita with new fear in his eyes. This didn't go unnoticed by the villain, and a saccharine sweet smile spread slowly across his face. So you do remember. Imagine how sad I was when you disappeared and stopped getting my mail. But then, you showed up again. So I pulled together some friends so we could have a surprise party. Do you like it?" He swept the arm not holding the gun out wide, gesturing to the whole youth. Screams and yells intermixed with the harsh noises of fighting drifted towards him from every corner, and he held back the urge to "I'm so glad I found you again. Here at UA. Tell me, Izuku-an, what's a murderer doing at a school for heroes?" And suddenly, Izuku could breathe. On the last word, Kawarita had blinked again, and Izuku used the opportunity to kick Kawarita's gun away from his face and scramble to his feet, pulling out his staff and extending it to its full height. Kawarita snarled and said, "You want to do this the hard way? Fine." He rushed at Izuku, gun pointed out and ready to fire. Izuku cursed himself for not disarming the man earlier and fell into an easy pattern of dodging, blocking, and attacking. Kawarita wasn't the strongest fighter, but he had a gun and Izuku couldn't afford to be cocky. Ducking under a heavy-handed swing with the butt of the gun, Izuku was about to wrap Kawarita in the solar plexus with his staff, taking him down and hopefully ending the fight. But at the edge of his awareness, Izuku saw Shigaraki move towards his dad, who was facing the wrong way. "Dad, watch dash." Izuku suddenly froze as he felt the cold barrel of Kawarita's gun. "Out! Meet the back of his head." His son's shout was enough to save Shoyuta from Shigaraki's sneak attack. It was not enough, unfortunately, to stop him from carving 5 bloody furrows into Shuta's arm. Jumping away to gain some distance, Shoyuta watched dispassionately as bits of his skin float down to touch the unyielding concrete beneath his feet. A disintegration quirk, then. Most likely 5-finger touch activated. The other villains backed off as Shigaraki approached, sensing their leader's unspoken declaration that he was going to get rid of Shoyuta. "Why are you here?" he asked as the two men began to circle each other. Shigaraki bared his teeth and said, "I'm not going to reveal my party objectives so early in the quest." A part of Shoyuta was rather taken aback at the strange video game metaphor. It sounded like something a child would say, not a villain leader that had managed to infiltrate UA. His response evaporated, however, when he caught sight of his son. During their conversation, they had circled around enough that Shoyuta could see that Izuku had a god-aiming gun to his head. It caught him off guard enough for Shigaraki to make his move, darting in and aiming for Shuta's neck. He only just managed to get his arm up to block, and he winced as the skin started to disintegrate. Shigaraki yanked him in close to hiss in his ear, "Don't go getting distracted, Eraserhead," before Shoyuta successfully pulled away, holding his injured arm close to his body so he could observe the damage. Shigaraki had disintegrated his elbow nearly to the bone, and it was next to useless until he could get it healed. Shoyuta glanced over to where his son still had his hands up with a gun to his head. He looked back at Shigaraki, and he realized 3 fundamental truths at the exact same time. The villain was facing in his direction. If he went across to save him now, there was every chance that the villain would shoot him, or worse, shoot Izuku. Shoyuta was not going to risk that. His son had extensive combat training and knew what to do in a situation like this. It was highly likely that he would be able to rescue himself. Shigaraki was an accomplished fighter. Ordinarily, Shoyuta would have been able to end this fight quickly, but he was weighted down by his injured arm. If he tried to leave this fight to get to Izuku, Shigaraki would definitely come after him, and he would have to fight off the gun villain and Shigaraki. With Izuku fighting next to him, it might be possible, but he didn't want to put his son in that kind of danger, and with the both of them having to split their attention, because you never take your eye off someone with a gun, the likelihood of one of them getting injured or killed was much higher than usual. Right then, Shoyuta thought to himself, "That settles that." As much as he hated it, the best course of action was for Shigaraki to go down and then rescue Izuku. Shoyuta fingered the ancient hiphus hanging at his waist before darting forward to land a kick on Shigaraki's knee, only for it to be blocked and the sole of his shoe disintegrated away. He smiled grimly. This was probably going to hurt. But for his kid, his students, he would get through it. "Hang on, everyone. I'm going to save you all." Izuku watched, helpless, as Shigaraki disintegrated his dad's elbow down to the bone. His dad glanced in his direction a couple of times, but eventually returned his attention to Shigaraki. Izuku breathed a sigh of relief. That was the right decision. The only reason Kawarita hadn't shot him yet was because he was monologuing, something about avenging his daughter's death? Izuku wasn't really listening. He figured it was probably better for his mental health, and he didn't want to risk breaking off Kawarita's train of thought. Gradually, he felt the pressure against the back of his head lessen, which meant Kawarita was letting his guard down. He needed to make his move. It was now or never. Well, he thought, here goes nothing. Mess this up and I'm dead. Moving as slowly as humanly possible, he shifted his weight to his left leg, before quickly crouching down and sweeping Kawarita's leg. At the same time, he grabbed the hand holding the gun, forcing it up in the air. A shot rang out. It ruffled Izuku's hair as it went past, a scant few centimeters from his scalp. Shuddering with the close call, Izuku grabbed the gun and tucked it into his belt. He wanted to kick it away, but he was surrounded by enemies. Kicking it away was as good as giving it back. He scooped up his staff from where he left it after Kawarita threatened him. With it back in his hand, he didn't feel so off-kilter. He felt like he could get everybody out of this mess. They were going to live to fight another day. He bared his teeth in a snarl in Kawarita's direction. These villains were going to rue the day they attacked him, his family and his friends. Kawarita Kazoku stared at the small, green-haired blight that had ruined his life, and saw his gun tucked into his belt. His gun. No, 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 no. This brat would not steal anything else from him. He had wanted to put a bullet in his brain. Quick, easy. He had thought that his daughter would be proud of him. Clearly not. This thing did not deserve a quick and easy death. He glanced at the men surrounding him and issued an order, the first one he had given in a very long time. He held the key and he would show them what it meant to be king. Get him. Katsuki was annoyed. This wasn't a new thing. It was very rare that he wasn't annoyed at something, whether that be his mum or the fact he wanted to be friends with a certain green-haired nerd. It was equally as rare, though, that he was annoyed because he was in a fight. Sparring was usually something that Katsuki found soothing. There were very few things that were better for getting anger out than punching the S out of something. But as he knocked out another S-Tai villain with an explosion to the face, Katsuki couldn't feel anything except bubbling rage. He wanted to get back to the plaza and punch the mist guy in the face, not least because he had the sinking feeling that Izuku was in trouble. That was so manly, poo bro, said Kirishima, standing behind him. His fire engine red hair was still stuck up in spikes, and it was at that moment that Katsuki decided on the perfect name for him, S-Tai Hair. Are we heading back to the plaza now? The newly dubbed S-Tai Hair asked. Katsuki grinned and smacked his fist into his palm, sparking an explosion. You better effing you bet we are, S-Tai Hair. Those villains weren't going to know what hit them. He ignored the outraged shout of S-Tai Hair in the background. Uraraka Achiko didn't know why, exactly, these villains were here. Didn't know what they wanted, didn't know their capabilities or their quirks. Really, Achiko thought, she didn't know much of anything. What she did know, however, was that her friends were stuck on a boat with her in the middle of the flood zone, and they didn't have a visible way out. Oh yeah, and the water was teeming with villains. That was also a thing. Surveying the area one last time, Achiko sighed and reached out with trembling fingers for Ida's shoulder. Shinso eyed her with concern. I thought you said you couldn't do that to yourself without getting nauseous? Achiko closed her eyes and swallowed bile. No, I can't. All of us together exceeds my weight limit, she didn't add. I don't know what the consequences of this are going to be. Instead she smiled, shaky. It's fine, Shinso-kun. So you can swing us over to dry land, and I'll just have to trust you to carry me to safety, yeah? She pressed her fingers to her chest without waiting for a reply and let nausea-induced blackness fill her sight. They would just have to hope that her quirk lasted long enough to get them to the other side. Sweep. Izuku wasn't sure exactly how long he had been fighting for now. The villain, Kawarita, his mind corrected him. His name is Kawarita Kazoku, and who's the real villain here when you killed his daughter? Had ordered the others to attack, and Izuku had stopped trying to finesse his way out of the situation, not that he'd been doing a very good job of that, and had let himself fall into the familiar pattern of fighting. Sweep. Izuku backflipped away from a heavy blow that would have taken his head off and considered his options. These villains were tenacious, and more importantly, there were a lot of them, which meant that Izuku was surrounded. While his sight meant that it was hard to sneak up on him, it didn't mean that he liked having to fend off enemies from all directions. Sweep. Suddenly, Izuku had an idea. He had wanted to practice this move a bit more before he actually used it in a combat situation, but desperate times, desperate measures, etc. Crouching low to the ground, Izuku swung his staff around him in a large arc, forcing the villains to move away, and allowing him to sweep his hand across the floor and stand back up, holding a small rock. Suddenly, the dust and rocks around him lit up caustic green and began to hover in the air. Izuku's vision filled with lines and the familiar brown color of rocks and dirt, with just the vague silhouettes of the people standing nearby. He twirled his wrist, carefully, and his miniature tornado began to swirl around, slowly at first, but then faster and faster. Izuku crouched down inside his makeshift barrier and waited for the villains to come to him. There are no such things as miracles. Miracles are statistical improbabilities caused by a set of coincidences that happen in just the right way and just the right place to create an unforeseen change. Midoriya Izuku had already borne witness to one such improbability in his life, the awakening of his quirk. And 8 years later, he was the catalyst for another. Our statistical improbability begins with two things: quirk laws and the unyielding forces of physics. As much as they seemed like magic, quirks were still products of man. Thus, they follow the laws of the universe. The funny thing about quirks, though, was that they also followed their own laws. Central, unshakable laws that made the basis of what a quirk was. Midoriya Izuku's quirk, for all that it seemed confusing and complicated, was actually very simple. Whatever happened to one object would happen to the other, in a set ratio. If a 1 cm rock is moved 1 meter, it will move a 2 cm rock 2 meters. The ratio is 2, a simple, unchangeable rule. Earlier, we remarked that miracles are statistical improbabilities, formed by an innocuous set of coincidences. That day in the USJ, there were 4. Here we find our first coincidence: a smooth, rounded rock that was almost at a perfect 4-to-1 ratio with the pebble that Midoriya Izuku was using to control his sandstorm. The second was less coincidence and more human error. A Yakuza grunt, eager and wanting to prove himself, decided to brave the sandstorm and kill the boy for his boss. Unaware of the more intricate, mental side of the young hero's quirk, he walked in directly behind Midoriya Izuku, assuming he was out of sight. The third coincidence was a small one, but no less important. As the grunt came close enough to Midoriya Izuku to be noticed, our rock was at a perfect 180 degrees angle with him. The fourth was an emotion: panic. Midoriya Izuku, when he realized an enemy was coming, panicked and turned around as fast as he could, without canceling the effects of his quirk. The laws of physics change for nothing, not even quirks. Newton's second law of motion is that force is equal to mass multiplied by acceleration. The boy turned around, and the rock he was holding gained enough force to knock over a soft drink can. The rocks it was linked to, though, affected by their set ratio as they were, gained enough force to rip through skin and bone. And they did. As Midoriya Izuku turned, so too did his storm. It faced this gang member and it attacked. Shoulder, leg, lower abdomen, arm. These were the places that the rocks sailed through, making the gangster fall and crumple to the ground. They were not life-threatening and he probably would have survived. Midoriya Izuku would have learned his name. He would have survived if a smooth, rounded rock had not been perfectly positioned to launch itself at his forehead with all the force of a bullet, punching through his skull and nestling itself in his brain. A perfect headshot. A miracle, no? There were 4 perfect holes in the man's body, Izuku realized. Could he the holes in the man's body, the gaps in his aura? The 5th hole was less perfect. It was a gaping chasm, a jagged hole. It didn't go right through, but it went in far enough. The gangster crumpled to the floor and lay there, twitching, which probably meant that the stone had reached his cerebellum, his movement cortex at the back of his brain. Izuku couldn't tear his focus away, in some terrible mix of terror and shock. Distantly he registered the rest of the villains pulling back, but he couldn't pull himself together enough to work out why. The rest of his mind watched, in horrified, guilty shock as the man's aura bled away, a twirling ribbon of lime green slowing and stopping, fraying and dispersing, until all that was left of the man was a gray corpse. Izuku turned away and barely resisted the urge to throw up. Kawarita walked forward, his leather business shoes clacking on the cobblestone in a regular rhythm. Izuku tried to stand up, when had he sat down, to move away, but found quite suddenly that his legs were no longer working. The man stopped just in front of Izuku and placed his hand on his head in a sick parody of the way his parents did, a twisted version of the comfort it was meant to show. Kawarita twisted his fingers in Izuku's hair and forced his head up, trying to make eye contact. Izuku just gazed listlessly past his shoulder, anchored down and floating all at once. The villain sneered. "Wow, Izuku-an, not even 15, and you've got a body count of 2. Wonder what your mother thinks of that." Something clicked in Izuku's brain. Or perhaps it flew loose. There was a man over there, and he was dead. Because of Izuku. No, not again. Izuku couldn't do this again. He was training to be a hero, and he had killed 2 people. Someone was saying something, but Izuku wasn't aware of it anymore. His brain was a mess of static, and suddenly the Yi fell away and he was 7 years old again, and the world was nothing but noise, and he could feel the burnt skin of his mother's corpse underneath his shaking hands. He was falling and he was sinking, rising and falling, and he didn't know where he was. When he was. I'm sorry, he told the darkness. I'm sorry, I'm so effing sorry, I didn't mean to. I didn't. You did, the darkness whispered back. You did, and you'll probably do it again, won't you? Liar. Murderer. Todoroki Shoto arrived back in the plaza of the USJ to the sound of quiet, muffled sobs. He quickly took in the scene. Midoriya was on his knees in the center, quietly crying and shaking all over like a leaf. A man was stood over him, smiling cruelly and reaching for the gun tucked into Midoriya's belt. All at once, his intentions became clear, and Shoto started forward. He wasn't about to let someone die, for God's sake. Not to mention that Midoriya seemed like a nice guy. He wouldn't care about you if he knew. It turned out he didn't have to, though, as the telltale sound of explosions suddenly registered in Shoto's ears, and Bakugo Katsuki launched forward from the shadows to throw an elbow into the side of the villain's head, knocking him out cold. The blonde came to a slow stop, breathing hard. His eyes came to rest on Midoriya, who was still crying and shaking on the cobblestone floor. He hadn't moved an inch, hadn't even reacted to the villain being taken down. Shoto frowned. He remembered long nights alone in his room when he would shake like that. Shoto vaguely recognized more of his classmates arriving, but he kept his eyes on Midoriya, and by extension, Bakugo. The latter sighed and knelt down next to the green-haired boy, slowly passing his hand in front of Midoriya's face. His classmate showed no acknowledgement of the action, and Bakugo cursed under his breath before straightening up and turning to face the little group. All right, we need to clean this up. Half and half, you think you could go help teach? Bakugo jerked his thumb over his shoulder, and Shoto saw Aizawa-sensei fighting with a villain covered in hands? Questionable fashion choices aside, the man seemed to be a good fighter, if the blood dripping from Aizawa-sensei's arm was any indication. Shoto nodded and began to walk towards the fight as the rest of them began to sort out who was doing what. As soon as he got close enough, Shoto twisted his right foot and let the ice grow, sending it along the ground and then suddenly upwards, enclosing the villain's right hand in ice. He broke it fairly quickly, but it was apparently all the opening Aizawa-sensei needed. The gray material of his capture weapon wrapped around the villain's torso, and a quick blow to the head ensured he was knocked out. Aizawa-sensei sighed and seemingly relaxed, closing his eyes for a brief second. Thanks for the assist, Todoroki. Suddenly his eyes sharpened. Where are the others? Shoto gestured wordlessly in the direction of the others. Bakugo was still with Midoriya, and the purple-haired boy, Shinto, apparently had captured the portal guy in some sort of trance with that mysterious quirk of his. All of Aizawa-sensei's attention, however, seemed to be on Izuku. What's the situation, Bakugo? He said, tense. Bakugo seemed just as worked up. We sent Ida to get help. I don't where the F the others are, and... He trailed off and just nodded in Midoriya's direction. The boy was still staring off into nothing, his pupils dilated. Aizawa-sensei grimaced, scooped Midoriya up in his arms. Hey, we need to dash. The rest of his sentence was cut off by the doors of the USJ pushing open again to reveal Snipe-sensei and present Mike-sensei. Snipe fired his gun at the missed villain. He must not realize that he's been caught already, Shoto realized, and Shinko released a strangled, no dash, before the portal villain seemed to awake from whatever trance he'd been in. A flash of black, and the hand villain, the villain who had been threatening Midoriya, and the portal villain were gone. Aizawa-sensei sighed, but gathered Midoriya closer to his chest, tucking the boy's head under his chin. As the paramedics and other faculty members began to swarm the USJ, Shoto thought he heard his teacher whisper, "It's all going to be okay, Izuku. It's all going to be okay." Aizawa Shoyuta woke up in the hospital. This was fine for all of 5 seconds until he remembered why he was in the hospital and sat up, ignoring the protests of his very sore arm, to frantically cast his gaze around the room for his son. Hisashi, who Shoyuta had only just realized was slumped in the visitor's chair next to the bed, was startled by the sudden movement and lifted his head, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes. What a Shoyuta, you're awake. I was so worried. Shoyuta tolerated his husband's fussing for a while before finally pushing him off to ask, "Where's Izuku?" Shoyuta saw Hisashi's face darken with worry for a moment before it was smoothed away into a blank facade. Wordless, he scooted his chair to the side, revealing that the figure lying in the bed next to him was no other than his son. His son, who was lying on his back and staring up at the ceiling with a terrifyingly blank look on his face. Hisashi caught the look on his face and turned around, gasping softly when he saw Izuku's face. Their son hadn't been awake long, then. Shoyuta swung his legs out of bed and stood up, moving to sit on the bed next to Izuku's prone body. Hisashi, catching on to his plan, quickly moved to sit on Izuku's other side. Slowly, Shoyuta raised his hand to rest it carefully on their son's forehead and brush his hair out of his face. Ordinarily, he would ask before touching him when he was like this, but Izuku wasn't in any place to respond and, more often than not, Izuku found the touch grounding. "Izuku?" Shoyuta asked softly. Their son made no outward reply but pushed his head up into Shuta's hand a bit. He took the hint and softly began to brush his hand through the tangled mess of green on Izuku's head. Hisashi, perched carefully on the other side of the bed, he was too tall to be able to sit comfortably, and any other time Shoyuta would have found it funny, cradled Izuku's hand in his and tried again. "Izuku? Greenbean? Are you there?" Izuku's eyes slipped close, and two tired, worried parents settled in for a long night of waiting. Izuku was asleep. He wasn't sure how he knew that because he wasn't usually aware of the fact that he was dreaming. He was pretty sure he'd read about something like this once. Lucid dreams? Was this a lucid dream? Izuku wasn't sure, but he didn't want to think about it too much. It was quiet here. He liked the quiet. Like just existing like this, lying of a bed of silken darkness. This was calm, soothing, far away from his mistakes. For a moment, the world around him brightened harshly, the split second of light after a lightning strike. In the judgment of its illumination, Izuku saw red on his hands, a plume of dust above his head. The images disappeared as soon as they came, leaving resentful brands on the back of his eyelids. A scream of "You did this" in the voice of a dead man. A second flash, another mistake. The flashes were red and orange and green, scarred with the aftermath of anger so great it made the world shake. "You did this," roared by the dual voices of the people he killed. "You did this," so loud that he could feel the blood dripping from his ears. No, that's not right. This wasn't real. Was it? Flowers bloomed on the floor, red and pink and white. He remembered a class that Midnight Sensei had done for him once, all about the language of flowers. He knew what these were. Crab blossoms, ill nature, ill intent. He almost stumbled with the weight of their silent accusation. He wanted to scream, to say, "I'm sorry," but who would listen? As if in answer, purple flowers grew over his hands, twisted themselves up his hands, their delicate petals turning in the direction of a non-existent sun. He knew these too, purple hyacinths, sorrow. The breath caught in his throat. This was the message he wanted to convey, the thought he wanted to voice but couldn't force past the lump in his throat. Izuku watched them bloom, and with every flowering of purple he thought, "I'm sorry." The meadow of crab apples slowed in their growth, and for one happy, delirious moment, Izuku thought he was heard, thought he was forgiven. Then the flowers curved themselves around his feet, curling thorny vines around his legs. As they grew, the crab apples changed, rounding themselves and crimping their petals, until the flowers inching their way up his body were yellow carnations. Disdain, disappointment, rejection. Izuku sobbed, and the flowers grew and twisted their thorns into his skin until the purple hyacinths were in mutilated piles on the ground, dotted with red. Izuku screamed. Izuku woke up. Hisashi jerked upright as soon as Izuku's hands started twitching. Shoyuta, on the other side of the bed, cast a wary eye over in his direction, but kept quiet. Silently, they watched as their son woke up, slowly and yet all at once. He seemed more awake than he had been earlier, casting lethargic eyes that glinted with recognition over their faces. "Hey there, Green Bean," Hisashi said quietly. "How are you feeling?" "I'm tired," came the response, slightly slurred, "and hungry." Hisashi laughed, softly. "I'll have to see what I can do about that, Green Bean." Izuku nodded blearily and burrowed his head into Shuta's leg. "Everyone else is okay?" "Everyone's fine, Green Bean. You and Shoyuta were the only ones who were hurt." The three of them stayed like that for an undeterminable amount of time, content to bask in comfortable silence. The moment was ripped apart, however, when the door creaked and voices floated in from the hallway. A middle-aged man in a detective's uniform poked his head in through the open door. "Excuse me? I'm Detective Tsukachi Naomasa. Are Eraserhead or Midoriya Izuku available to give statements right now?" Shoyuta looked down questioningly at their son, who blinked then nodded once. Hisashi turned to Tsukachi and said, "As long as it doesn't take too long. Izuku needs to rest." The detective stepped inside quietly, saying, "Of course. I hope you don't mind if I dash?" he said as he pointed to the unoccupied chair on the other side of the bed. Wordlessly, Hisashi scooted over and the detective took the offered seat. "Thank you. Before we begin, I would like to inform you that my quirk, lie detector, allows me to know when someone is lying. Although I don't see that becoming a problem in this conversation, I am legally obliged to notify you about it." Izuku stirred slightly in bed, and when Hisashi glanced over at his son he noticed that his eyes had regained a little bit of life. "That's a cool quirk," the boy stated softly, his voice horribly low and rough. "How does it work?" Although it wasn't quite the question storm that Izuku might have given a few days before, this small sign of progress was still heartening. The detective blinked slightly before letting loose a small laugh. "Thank you for the compliment, but it's not all that complicated, Midoriya-san. If someone lies to me, my quirk simply informs me." Hisashi, noticing how Izuku looked ready to retort, quickly interjected, "I'd like for my husband and child to get back to sleep soon, so if you don't mind, Tsukachi-san?" Tsukachi nodded, "Yes, of course. This won't take too long. I just need you to recount the events of the USJ attack to me as best you can. Would you like to start, Aizawa-san?" Shoyuta sighed, but quickly and succinctly related the events of the day before to him. The portal, Shigaraki, the unknown villain. Hisashi had known it was bad, but to hear what his family had gone through without his knowledge made him sick to his stomach. Tsukachi sighed and closed his notebook with a snap. "You have my gratitude, Aizawa-san. This has been very informative. Unless you have anything to add, Midoriya-san?" Izuku bit his lip and looked off to the side before answering, slow and quiet, "Just one thing. The other villain that was there, the one with the G-gun, he introduced himself as Kawarita Kazoku. Said he was the father of the girl from the mall." His eyes slid sideways to meet first Shuta's, then Hisashi's. "You remember?" Hisashi essayed in a large breath through his teeth. God, did he remember? It had been years, but those long months of terror were hard to forget. Months of death threats in the mail, unexplained break-ins, vandalisms, and beneath it all, the creeping paranoia that would wake him up, ashen-faced, in the middle of the night. Shoyuta swore quietly. Hisashi swallowed. That about summed it up, actually. Izuku was very tired when they finally managed to get back to the dorms. After he had dropped the bombshell about Kawarita, Detective Tsukachi had talked with his parents for a while longer before they managed to make their escape from the hospital. Pops had wanted him and Dad to stay in the hospital another day, but both of them were adamant that they wanted to get back to UA as soon as possible. All that had meant was that by the time they arrived at UA, it was already 7 p.m. Izuku had been yawning for the past half hour. You'd think that sleeping for 14 hours would make someone less tired, but nope. He was exhausted. So when he heard raised voices coming from the common room, he was halfway tempted to just turn around and go and sleep at his parents'. But Hitoshi had already seen him and had started waving, so Izuku was stuck. Walking in through the doors, and resolutely ignoring the shouting match Kaken was having with Ida, probably something about school regulations again. Izuku made a beeline for the couch Hitoshi was sitting on with Uraraka and drifted off, leaning against his friend's shoulder. It wasn't until he heard someone call his name, was that Yaoyorozu, that he jerked back to awareness and promptly fell off the couch. He could hear Hitoshi cackling behind him, the traitor. With as much dignity as he could, which wasn't very much, he picked himself up off the ground and asked, "Sorry, Yaoyorozu, I didn't quite hear you. What was that?" He could tell that Yaoyorozu was trying to hide a smile behind her hand, but neither of them commented on it as she replied, "No problem, Midoriya. I was just saying how we should do something to get to know each other better. Oh, and please, call me Yamamo." Izuku snapped into a salute and said, "Sounds like a good idea to me, Vice Prez," in the snootiest voice he could manage. That made Yamamo giggle, but before she could reply Mina had already bounded across the room, saying, "Oh, a game. We should play a game." Izuku collapsed back onto the couch, noticing that at some point Uraraka had left to join the ever-growing crowd of people in the middle of the common room. Suddenly Hitoshi elbowed him, leaning over to say, "I didn't know you had a crush on Yamamo." Izuku spluttered and nearly fell off the couch again, only just catching himself in time. "What the— no," he hissed, mindful of the very busy room they were having this conversation in. "What made you think that? Vice Prez?" Hitoshi mimicked, in a whiny voice that was clearly meant to be an impression of him. Why was Izuku friends with this JRK again? "Oh my god, Hitoshi, no." "What, I can't be friends with a girl without it turning into a relationship?" he retorted, feeling quite angry all of a sudden. Hitoshi held out for all of 30 seconds before he collapsed onto his side laughing, saying, "I was just teasing, but the look on your face dash." Izuku shoved him off the couch and buried his bright red face in his hands. "What? JRK." The next day was weirdly normal for Kyuka after the events of yesterday. They arrived in class, sat down, and Aizawa-sensei rocked up in his yellow sleeping bag to announce that the sports festival would be happening in 2 weeks. Ah well, they thought, head down on the desk while the class erupted into hysterics around them. It was a nice dream while it lasted. "Normalcy, I never knew ya." "Quiet!" Aizawa-sensei thundered from the front of the classroom. "Heroics classes will be used to prepare for the sports festival however you want. Don't waste the time you've been given." As the room became a flurry of noise around them, all of their classmates planning various different training sessions, Yamamo caught their eye from across the classroom and winked at them. FING winked at them. Kyuka looked away even as they flushed red, all the way to their hairline. Maybe normalcy was overrated after all. "I'm really sorry guys, but I don't think I will be updating this anytime soon. My muse has deserted me and life is really busy right now. I barely have enough energy to write, let alone for a fandom I am no longer really in. I dislike leaving things unfinished, so I may continue this at some point, but this probably won't be for a while. Sorry again, and thank you to everyone who has read, left comments on, or given kudos to this FIC. I love and appreciate you all, you're amazing."